Israel is not only potentially to conduct a retaliatory strike, if you will, but also defense-wise to withstand a potential attack like this, knowing that we don't actually know what form, if at all, this will happen in. How strong is the Iron Dome, our Israeli defense forces, to withstand it from wherever it comes from?
Yes, I mean, the Israelis have excellent air and missile defense systems. That should obviously be acknowledged. I think the issue is that any kind of air and missile defense system can eventually be swamped, saturated by sheer numbers of incoming targets. So if the Iranians were to elect to strike Israel, if they make these volleys with missiles and drones large enough, they have the potential to leak through, to be able to overwhelm these systems.
Kelly, it's great to have you back. Kelly Grieco is Senior Fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. Kaylee, we've got breaking news that I want to mention before we turn next to our panel. U.S. Steel shareholders approving Nippon Steel's takeover offer. This is something that was anticipated. U.S. Steel shares right now are actually lower. They're down by about 2% on this news, but it's awfully important knowing the administration's stand on this, which apparently does not agree with the shareholders.
Well, and it's worth noting the offer price was $55 per share. Today, as we speak, you mentioned down 2%. We're trading at $41, so there is still a large gap. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's not just shareholders that ultimately need to give this the go-ahead. You have a CFIUS review. There are national security concerns in question. The Department of Justice has opened an antitrust investigation into this. And then you also need to get the union on board, as the United Steelworkers Union, according to the President of the United States, is backed by Biden in this.
Yeah, this clearly is something that investors are betting may not happen. You had the Japanese prime minister in town for the last couple of days. They apparently didn't even bring it up, Kaylee. So we'll keep you posted on this. The shareholders give it a thumbs up and the stock goes down. We'll have our political panel for you next. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks again holding at the lows of the day with the S&P 500 index now down 81 points. That is a drop of 1.6%. Dow Industrials down 518 points now, sliding by 1.4%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 284. For Nasdaq, a drop right now of just about 1.7%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.49%. The 2-year 4.87%. Spot gold at $23.57, down $15 the ounce right now, a decline of 0.6%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 88 cents a barrel, 85.90 on WTI. That is a gain right now of just over 1%. The global financial world is being roiled by a flare-up in geopolitical risks that has sent stocks sliding while spurring a flight to the safest corners of the market, from bonds to gold and the dollar. Again, oil is rallying, equities falling at the end of a wild week. Again, the S&P down 83. That is a drop right now of 1.6%. Beijing has ordered telecom carriers like China Mobile to replace foreign chips in their core networks by 2027. This according to the Wall Street Journal, citing sources. It deals a potential blow to American chip makers Intel and Advanced Micro Devices. Intel down 4.5% today. Advanced Micro Devices lower now by 4.3%. At the Masters, it is a windy day today. Another windy day. Round 2 in progress. Max Homa, Bryson DeChambeau are tied atop the leaderboard at 7 under par. And Tiger Woods, who is attempting to make the cut for a record 24th time, is 1 over. Again, recapping, S&P down 83, drop of 1.6%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, here they are. We've got Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Checking on the markets for us from New York. I'm Kaylee Lyons in Washington alongside Joe Matthew, where we have learned many times, Joe, if at first you don't succeed, perhaps you try again, whether it's the FISA vote that didn't succeed until the 4th time, or whether it's attempting to forgive student loans. You tried to do it in a broad-based fashion if you're President Biden, the Supreme Court strikes it down, and instead you try again in smaller increments. And once again, we're getting more increments today. Another $7.4 billion in federal student debt going to be relieved.
I like the way you did that. I feel like we all have second chances.
Right.
Maybe that's the case for Joe Biden. He's doing the same thing for the border, by the way. That might be his 3rd swing at that one. Try again with our panel. Rick Davis is with us, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, longtime Republican strategist, joined by Democratic strategist Pat Dennis. He's the president of American Bridge 21st Century. Pat, this matter of forgiving student debt has been a sticky one for Joe Biden, and a lot of young people feel like he simply did not make good on a promise, regardless of his try again and the fact that the Supreme Court is the one that stopped it. How important will this be as a tool for him in the campaign?
It's important. I mean, it's important that voters see you not giving up on delivering on your campaign promises, delivering for voters. You know, you're gonna see a ton of complaining from Republicans who are gonna sue to try to stop this. They're gonna try to, prevent this debt from being forgiven, life-changing amounts of debt in some cases. And, if you show me a powerful Republican who opposes this measure, I'll show you somebody who got a PPP loan forgiven, either themselves or, their biggest donor. So it seems to me like we're not so much arguing about like whether debt should be forgiven. It should be about whose.
Well, Rick, Pat, the words Pat just used there, the idea that you need to be seen not giving up on something, continuing to try, is that what this is really about? Not so much the outcome as the effort if you're a presidential candidate? Or do you need outcomes for when voters go to the polls in November and think, okay, what has he actually done for me?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think politically you want outcomes. You want that money hitting the street before Election Day. None of these funds will actually make their way into reliefs will make its way into the balance sheet of most of these folks before Election Day. So you have to consider it mostly rhetoric. We know that the courts, not Republicans, have had a lot of problems with mission creep by this administration around these kinds of debt relief efforts on the part of the administration. So that's going to play out in the courts, regardless of what the politics of the situation is. And look, I mean, it's kind of a naked grab for youth votes. And it's not the 18 to 25-year-olds. They're the ones who are generating the debt right now. It's mostly the 30 to 55-year-olds who still have been carrying around a lot of this debt for a long time. And I don't think anybody disagrees that student debt burdens are not good for the economy, but it's an incredibly unfair approach, which is those people who carried the most debt, not the ones who paid off their loans, not the ones who couldn't get a loan and didn't go to college and went to maybe community college or didn't go to anything other than a high school education. What's in it for them? They're taxpayers too. They're funding this, and so I think Pat's right. The issue isn't whether you're doing it; it's who's it go to. And right now, it's going to a group of people who it's just not doesn't pass the fairness quotient by American standards.
Well, it's interesting, Pat, when we talk about other people paying for stuff here, because there's a story today by Axios that Joe Biden actually used campaign money. It was DNC cash, $1.5 million to pay for lawyers, to pay for legal bills in the special counsel's probe into his handling of classified documents. Remembering, he spent a lot of time criticizing Donald Trump for using campaign money to pay for his attorney's fees. And I know we're talking about $1.5 million versus in excess of $50 million. But it's these little things. It's partly the reason why people aren't talking about Donald Trump's classified documents case, because Joe Biden got one of his own, realizing there may not be a moral equivalency here. How tough is this headline when you see something like this in leaving Joe Biden incapable or maybe not credible in some of his attacks against Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's classic whataboutism, right? You do 1/1000th of something that totally makes sense, but kind of rhymes in some way with something egregious that Trump did, and all of a sudden, people are jumping down your throat about it. This is the kind of thing where there's absolutely no equivalence between what the DNC did here, some routine legal bills. I run a super PAC. I wish I could get legal bills down to $1.5 million sometimes, but and what Trump has done, which is frequently deceive his donors, folks who thought they were giving to win elections, or folks who thought they were, giving based on big lie rhetoric. And he just took that money and put it in his own pocket for his own personal legal bills. There's no equivalence here.
Well, Pat, it all speaks to this idea that there is legal trouble surrounding the former president as he is campaigning against Biden in the general election. And really, it's going to come to the forefront of attention on Monday when his trial, the first ever criminal trial of a former president, begins in New York. It could last 6 to 8 weeks, but realistically, we're talking before the convention here. This could be wrapped up, and there is a chance he ends up a convicted felon. What would change for the Biden campaign at that point, if he's convicted or if he's not?
Yeah, and it's important people don't forget, Michael Cohen went to jail over this exact thing, not something similar, this exact issue. It's really serious for him. And look, Republicans will do everything they can to cover up for him, to act like this is no big deal, to act like this is some kind of partisan witch hunt. But this is the legal system. This is the legal system that sent Michael Cohen to jail when he was Trump's enemy at the time. And it's, it's a big deal. I'm not going to talk about the who's up, who's down of a major candidate being found guilty of felonies. I think we can all agree that that's not good. But ultimately, Republicans are going to have to decide exactly how far down this doom loop they're going to follow him.
Well, that's right. Rick, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this. Joe Biden having the DNC pay for his attorneys. Does that not sound like Donald Trump? You can talk about equivalency, but perception's reality.
Well, this is all self-inflicted pain. The campaign's finance chairman goes out and says, we don't spend money on legal bills. Then the DNC in their filings shows clearly that they spent money, over $1 million for Bob Bauer, who was representing the president in his documents case. So that's exactly what they did. And if they just kept their mouth shut and didn't make a big deal of it, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But don't cast stones into that glass house if yours is still pretty thin itself. Look, I think the issue of those documents cases with the sensitive and confidential information that Trump had and Biden had were handled differently by each individual. And I think, the president handled his more responsibly. But then don't go lying about, whether or not you spent DNC money on it, because you did. And and just come clean. That's what American voters want. They want someone who, they don't really care whether you use the money at the DNC for this. What they care about is you weren't really straight with them about it. And I think that could be a breakaway moment for this campaign, Biden, because there's no chance that Donald Trump's ever going to be straight with anything or apologize. And Biden does have the opportunity to be running a campaign that actually is more transparent and honest with the press and with the voters.
So, Rick, essentially what you're saying is, while sometimes the former president can say things that are outright untruthful and either people believe him or decide that it's just Trump being Trump, that Biden is not held to that same standard, or rather Trump is not being held to the same standard Biden is.
Yeah, I just don't think there's an expectation that you're ever going to get a truthful statement out of Trump. So he kind of gets a pass, right? Go lie all day long and the press doesn't even report it. But Biden holds himself out as being the truth teller, right? And that's a very good place to be in this election, I think. You want to own that ground. You want to be the fact-based campaign. So you just got to be a little more careful with how you then represent yourself when things like this happen. It would have been absolutely fine for the Biden campaign to say, yeah, we probably should have told the press that, we were using, over $1 million to pay for our bills. I don't think anybody would have cared at that stage, and it would have drawn a contrast to, the kind of transparency that the Trump campaign's given their donors versus those that are being given by the DNC. I guarantee you the DNC donors were happy to do that. It wasn't an egregious amount, but, they never gave them a chance because they really didn't, come straight with them.
All right, Rick Davis, Republican strategist, and Pat Dennis, our Democratic strategist, joining us today from American Bridge. Thank you so much. And it's worth pointing out as well, Joe, as we talk about the idea that the DNC and the RNC might be spending money in similar ways in regard to legal matters. The DNC has a lot more money to spend than the RNC right now.
The campaign does.
Yeah.
The party apparatus does. It's been something like 2 to 1 on a fairly consistent basis here. And we've certainly talked about Donald Trump's cash burn. It's going to be a long summer for him, Kaylee.
Indeed. A long summer for all of us, including Nancy Lyons. She's got a check right now for us on world and national news in our 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Nancy.
Thanks, Kaylee. The U.S. Embassy in Israel is warning its staff to stay put for fear Iran will retaliate from last week's deadly strike on its consulate in Syria. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has assured his Israeli counterpart the U.S. will provide support against any attacks from Iran. And Joint Chiefs Chairman General C.Q. Brown tells CBS Mornings he's talking with his counterparts in the region to try and prevent any attack.
We're really trying to avoid war, and this is part of the dialogue that I have with my counterparts within the region, to include the Israeli Chief of Defense, who I talked to yesterday. And we're doing things not only to prevent a war, but at the same time, one of my primary things is to make sure that all of our forces in the region are protected.
Sources tell Bloomberg an assault is expected to come as soon as the next 48 hours. The House has advanced a 2-year extension of Section 702 of the FISA Act. That legislation allows the U.S. to surveil foreign targets. Just yesterday, FBI Director Christopher Wray told lawmakers an extension was needed to keep Americans safe. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks continue to move to the right and down. We're looking at lows of the day again right now on the S&P, now down 85 points, a drop today of 1.6%. 5113 is where we stand on the S&P 500 index. Dow Industrials down 555 points now for the Dow, a drop of 1.5%. Nasdaq is down 289 points, a decline of 1.8%, and the Nasdaq 100 index also down 1.8%. Small cap shares down by 1.9%. The 10-year yield, 4.48%. The 2-year, 4.86%. Spot gold right now is down $18 the ounce to $23.53, a decline of 0.8%, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil is pushing higher, up 1.1%, $85.96 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks are getting hit amid war jitters. The S&P again trading lower by 84 points, down 1.6%. Bank earnings also weighing on sentiment today. After earnings, J.P. Morgan Chase down now by 6.2%. Citigroup after earnings down 2.5%. Wells Fargo after earnings down by 0.8%. Recapping, a sell-off underway on this Friday. S&P now down 84, a drop right now of 1.6%. Balance of power continues in Washington. Back we go, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, I am Kaylee Lines in Washington for now, but Charlie Pellet, I will see you next week because I will be heading to New York on Monday for the beginning of a historic proceeding, the first criminal trial of a former U.S. President, Donald Trump, unless we see a delay he's asking for.
Yeah, right.
Will go on trial in New York in the hush money case involving Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, we feel like we've done this already. Obviously, people have gone through this case. They've heard about the hush money payments. They remember Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, Lanny Davis on TV every night. But this is the actual trial. And when you're up there on Monday, they're going to start assembling a jury. And based on this questionnaire, Kaylee, jury selection in itself could be wild.
Yeah, they need to find a dozen jurors, and they are going to be essentially judging someone who, yes, is their peer, but also is a former president of the United States, current presidential candidate, someone with incredible name recognition.
Yes.
So they're going to be asked things like, do they have political, moral, intellectual, or religious beliefs or opinions that may slant their approach to this case? It's going to be tough work to actually identify these dozen individuals, and you need the alternates as well. And that is where we begin with Nick Ackerman, a former Watergate prosecutor who is joining us now. Nick, it's always great to have you on the show. We will get to jury selection in a moment, but first, do you see any possible chance that this is delayed and this doesn't in fact start on Monday the 15th?
Boy, I don't see it. I know Trump is probably trying every trick in the book, but I just don't see there being a delay. He tried 3 times this week and was denied by the appeals court all 3 times.
That said, we'll start Monday. And I was just referencing the questionnaire for jurors. Nick, what is this going to be like? They're going to be asking people if they have Truth Social accounts, among other things. Everybody in New York knows about this story. Is it possible to find and assemble a fair jury?
Oh, definitely. You will be surprised how many people in New York have not paid attention to this story or paid attention to the fact of this case. It never ceases to amaze me. I've had other jury selections in high-profile cases where I thought for sure it would be difficult, but it never is. And it wasn't difficult to find 2 juries in the E. Jean Carroll case, and that didn't take too long. The real key here is whether or not the individuals who are going to be on that jury can be fair and impartial, even if they know who the defendant is and they have some rough idea about the case.
Well, so let's get into the details of the case then, Nick, because obviously what we're talking about here is 34 counts of falsifying business records. In New York, typically this would be a misdemeanor. The reason why this is a felony in this case is because Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, is arguing that this was used in violation of election law because this was done during the 2016 election, allegedly. How hard is this case going to be to prosecute? Sure.
It's not going to be just on election law. It's not just federal. It's also state election law. And it's also tax violations. So what Alvin Bragg has to prove is that there was an intent to commit those crimes. And it's not that unusual. I mean, this is a pretty run-of-the-mill charge that's made on the state level. And the fact that it's made into a felony is not that unusual either.
So you think this case is easier for the prosecution than the defense?
Well, much easier. I mean, they've got two cooperating witnesses. It's not just Michael Cohen, his former lawyer. It's also David Pecker, who was the owner of the National Enquirer, who together met with Donald Trump to come up with this catch and kill scheme, whereby they would try and look for stories that were derogatory of Donald Trump and make payoffs like they did with Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal to keep those stories from ever seeing the light of day before the presidential election in 2016.
I know this trial is supposed to last 6 weeks. That's the estimation. Nick, if jury selection becomes painful, maybe it won't, in your view, as they talk about everything from QAnon to Antifa. But if that became a more protracted process, does the trial creep into 2 months? What's your thought now on duration?
Well, it's very hard to tell. I really don't think jury selection is going to be that long. You talk about Antifa and QAnon. The fact of the matter is jurors are going to have to express certain knowledge about these areas. It all goes to whether they can be fair and impartial. Both the defense and the government have the opportunity to raise with the judge disqualifications of jurors for cause. But on top of that, they each have what are known as preemptory challenges, which means that they can essentially dismiss a certain number of jurors. Each side has those because they just don't feel comfortable with them for whatever reason, as long as it's not based on a racial or ethnic reason.
Nick, something else I want to bring up is the gag order that the judge has put into place for this trial. It has actually been expanded to include the judge himself and his family, but also other officials of the court and other potential likely witnesses like Stormy Daniels or Michael Cohen, who we've talked about. And on True Social on Wednesday, Trump said that those two are two sleazebags who have, with their lies and misrepresentations, cost our country dearly. Where is the line of what violates this gag order?
No doubt in my mind that violates the gag order. This is a case that absolutely needs a gag order. It's like an organized crime case to the extent that people's lives, witnesses in particular, family of the court, are really put in jeopardy. It's not so much by Donald Trump himself, but what he says to some of his supporters who are clearly a bit unhinged. We saw that happen in North Carolina, where an individual showed up with a loaded gun at an FBI office. Ultimately, he was killed in the process. We saw this happen in Utah. There is a real present danger here that what Trump says is going to have a real-life impact on the safety of witnesses, jurors, and court personnel. So I think the judge is going to handle this somehow. We'll see. I think the real problem is that most all of these judges are afraid to put Trump in jail, which they would do with any other defendant who violated this kind of a gag order. And they're afraid to do that until such time as a jury of 12 people convict him of a crime. Now, he's got other possibilities here in terms of how he could punish him, either through fines or through other parts of the trial, which he could wind up giving a charge on this issue that would not be too helpful to Donald Trump. What's so unusual here is, in all my years of experience, I've never seen a defendant go this far attacking people involved in the case, particularly the judge. I mean, that's the last person you'd ever want to attack, because at the end of the day, that judge is going to have total discretion as to whether the defendant goes to jail, gets probation, whatever that sentence is. You don't want, if it's my client, I would not want him doing anything that in any way undermined the judge's ability to look at him in a complete void of any kind of threats like Donald Trump is making.
Nick Ackerman, it's always great to have you back. We'll be thinking about this talk when the trial starts on Monday. Of course, former assistant U.S. attorney and former special Watergate prosecutor, with us today on Balance of Power. Fascinating, Kaylee. You're going to be there first thing Monday morning. You're going to join us on this broadcast.
Indeed.
From the courthouse. That could be a real circus.
Indeed, especially because we're talking about a former president, so security, media attention. It's going to be...
You've done a couple of these already.
Quite a few weeks.
When was Miami?
Last June, hottest I've ever been, ever. That was when he was arraigned in the documents case, which we don't even know when that trial will begin yet, if it at all could happen before the election.
Losing track of the cases
There's
and the timeline at this point, but so we'll forgive you for doing the same. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington as we prepare for the weekly edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, and our friend David Weston, who joins us each week around this time from World Headquarters in New York. David, we've almost survived another week, just barely around here. It's great to see you as we talk about so many cross currents from geopolitics to inflation and interest rates this week. We've kind of covered it all in Washington. How you're bringing it all together on Bloomberg?
Well, we'll have Larry Summers. You'll hear from him, of course, about what's going on there. We're also going to touch on AI with Sam Palmisano, former head of IBM. But one of the things we're going to touch about happened down in your neck of the woods in Washington, where we had the Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida, come visit President Biden. Yes. That was sort of overshadowed, I thought, a bit by the dispute over the Nippon Steel proposal to buy U.S. steel. So we got Bob Zoellick on to talk about what that is. As you know, Bob Zoellick was the head of the World Bank, but he also was United States Trade Representative under Bush 41. And he has some pretty strong views about how both President Biden and former President Trump are looking at this issue. He thinks they're looking at it the wrong way around, that we don't need to protect these manufacturing jobs. That, in fact, we're doing just fine in manufacturing jobs. But one of the things that I asked Joe and Kaylee was, well, okay, fine. If it's a matter of more productivity from the workers you have, so you don't need to have as many workers, you don't need to worry about that, then what does that say for the relatively less skilled workers? And then Bob Zoellick had something about the subsidies we're seeing, for example, from the CHIPS Act, and how we could spend them better. This is part of what Bob had to say.
Take, for example, we've added about $50 billion of subsidies we now want to have for semiconductors. Well, maybe that money would be better spent in terms of the education and skills and workforce for sort of the next sort of generation. That's the key to the politics. You need to help people adapt to change, whether it's with health cares and pension and others. But, there's this old view, which you referenced, is that the manufacturing jobs pay better. Actually, the average manufacturing jobs wages are less than the average salary for all other jobs. Now, these aren't people just all doing, sophisticated computer work. There's a variety of different types of services, and those services reflect what Americans want to buy. And so, as I said, it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. You see it all around the world. People used to be primarily farmers. Then they moved to manufacturing. Now you're going to move to sophisticated services industries, and you have to help people adapt to change.
So that's Bob Zoellick. That's his take on it. He thinks basically, as I say, both President Biden and former President Trump are wrong about it. But it's a popular thing to say we need to bring those manufacturing jobs back, even though a lot of the reasons why there are fewer manufacturing jobs is just the manufacturing workers we have are much, much more productive.
Well, and I would imagine when you factor things like artificial intelligence and automation into that, then perhaps that even reinforces that argument more so, David.
Well, absolutely, Kaylee. Although I think what Bob Zoellick would say is when you factor in things like artificial intelligence, there will be other jobs created by that, in fact, that will be better paying jobs, but they do take more skilled workers, perhaps, and that's where we should be paying our time and attention. But as you know so well, Kaylee and Joe, we've got both of these candidates really talking a lot about manufacturing and really protecting manufacturing. Maybe not coincidentally, because Pennsylvania is where U.S. Steel is. You think that's sort of an important
Yeah, they want that
state?
Union vote.
Yeah, exactly.
Michigan as well.
Yeah, well, although Michigan goes the other way, actually. The Michigan representatives have said they're happy with the deal because they want cheaper steel for the cars.
Fair point.
Then again, and I won't ask you about EVs as part of the conversation here, David, but you're right. Both of these candidates, the president and the former president, have been talking about this, and they're subject to, at the mercy of, the very issue of AI that you were talking about here. We still have yet to set guardrails on how AI should be used in this campaign, and I'm still out there talking about the potential for a deep fake as an October surprise that could, in fact, impact the election.
Yeah, we have to be very concerned about that. That's exactly right. And it's something we don't really know how to deal with. I will say we have Sam Palmisano, as I said, from IBM on it. And he said, look, at the big tech CEOs really want regulation when it comes to AI. They're asking for regulation. But he makes an important distinction I hadn't thought of before. He said, if you're going to regulate the use of the technology, not the technology. Because you regulate the technology, that inhibits innovation, which you don't want to do. And he's saying that from his experience with past technological innovation.
All right, David Weston, host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. Looking forward to the rest of the show, which will air tonight at 6 p.m. Wall Street time. Always on Friday. We appreciate it. And of course, before we can get to 6 p.m., before we can even get to the 5 p.m., when Joe and I will be back, we got to get through Bloomberg Business Week as well, which Carol Master and Tim Stenovic are gearing up for. Also in New York, what do you guys have coming up on the show today?
I got to say, I'm kind of glued to the markets right now. In particular, something you guys have been talking we've been listening very closely to what you guys, some of the conversations around concerns about geopolitics, in specific, what's going on in the Middle East and what might happen between Iran and Israel. We're really worried, no doubt about it.
Also talking big banks, we got Shonali joining us right at the top of the hour to give us an update on the three big banks that reported early this morning and a little preview for what's to come next week as well.
Indeed. JP Morgan right now, Joe, taking it on the chin, down almost 6%.
JP Morgan, brutal day as well for U.S. Steel for other reasons, even though shareholders approved that deal. All comes back to Washington on that one because no one thinks that it's going to be approved. We've got a lot more to do later on. To your point, Kaylee, I'll meet you at 5 o'clock.
Sounds good.
Right here on Bloomberg.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on Bloomberg Radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. Let's get to the setup on this busy Friday, April 12th, 2024. And Tim, we've got stocks down, bonds up, geopolitical risks once again front and center. Investors seeking safe havens of U.S. Treasuries, also moving into gold, also moving into the U.S. dollar. And then we've also seen some moves in U.S. crude.
Yeah, Brent and WTI are off their highs. So too are the big banks as earnings season is underway, following results from JP Morgan, Citi, and Wells Fargo. All of them, Carol, especially JP Morgan, selling off today. These banks certainly top of mind.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a moment. Plus, as we said, the Middle East conflict. What happens if Iran retaliates as expected against Israel? What does that mean? Then what? We're going to ask that question to an inside policy individual who worked for the U.S. government on just this for many years.
Also, what are the three topics that are top of mind for CEOs? We're going to talk with a consultant a little later in the program all about that.
I wonder if geopolitics is part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good prediction.
All right, and then we've got one more thing, something lighter fare on what feels like a pretty heavy Friday. California's historic wage hike for fast food workers driving McDonald's to do something unusual. And this to kind of help out, I guess, when it comes to cost. One hint, it's something that we New Yorkers, we kind of consider it pretty near and dear.
Yeah, I'd say pretty sacred in New York.
All right, we're going to get to that in just a moment.
All that and more. First up, though, a check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Much indeed. We are trading very close to session lows right now, right to the numbers. We got ourselves some fast-moving markets to the downside here, with the S&P slumping 81 points right now at 51.17 for the S&P 500 index. We're looking at a drop right now of just about 1.6%. The Dow down 532 points, lower by 1.4%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index is down 286, a decline right now of 1.7%. 10-year 4.48%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.86%. Gold retreating $18 the ounce now, $23.53, was trading above $2,400 earlier today. Right now we've got gold down 0.8%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil pushing higher by 1.1%, 85.94 a barrel on WTI. Barrel of Brent up 1%. Brent, of course, the global benchmark at 90.64. Bank earnings front and center today. Right now, JP Morgan Chase shares after earnings, they are down 5.9%. Citigroup after earnings down 2.4%. Wells Fargo after earnings down 0.4%. And of course, our Sonali Basak will have a whole lot more of the banks coming up in just a moment. Again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, Nasdaq very much in the red right now. S&P down 81, close to session lows. That is a drop now of 1.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Perfect setup for Sonali Basak, who's going to join us now to talk about the three big banks reporting. It feels like JP Morgan, though, really, when you look at the share price, taking the biggest hit, almost down, about 6%. She has been up early, bright and early this morning, tracking it all. She joins us here in studio. Sonali, you were up as the numbers were coming out and breaking it down. The three of them, I guess we should start with JP Morgan, because I do feel like investors, a lot of disappointment when it comes to JP Morgan, the bank we probably watch most closely.
Well, one thing that's curious is just how much the stock has been falling today, because it is the worst day it's having since March of 2023. And of course, for a firm that is still making about an estimated $90 billion of net interest income this year, you have to wonder whether the market is starting to recalibrate their excitement about higher interest rates and the potential for future net interest income for these banks. The question I keep asking, is this a general feel that the market is tapping out, that the consumer is tapping out and can't really borrow that much more on credit cards here? Because remember, the American consumer is already sitting on a record mountain of credit card debt of more than $1 trillion at record high APRs.
So there's a point where that taps out. You would assume.
You would assume. You know, the thing that JP Morgan said about this was that you have many consumers, wages are keeping up, they're still spending. Spending is at levels roughly about where it was last year. Right. But lower income consumers are starting to feel some stresses. And remember, this is still a strong economy. All the economic data has pointed to strength in the labor market and broadly strong growth. But inflation is going to take a bite, and eventually interest rates will too. So at what point does Main Street start to catch up to Wall Street? you're seeing the stock reaction, even with the core Wall Street businesses, meaningfully bouncing back. Investment banking is coming back. Trading beat estimates for Citigroup and JP Morgan. But you have the market, and again, remember, it's a tough tape out there. It is a really tough
But
market.
they were down out of the gate this morning.
They certainly were. And remember, another thing about this is JP Morgan going into the season was trading at the best price to book multiple. So perhaps investors now taking some chips off the table as they digest this news that was not as great as what they wanted for net interest income.
Not as great, but fair to call any part of it a disappointment? I mean, the stock reaction today would indicate that there is some disappointment.
Yes. Well, the big thing was twofold. One is that they did not raise their guidance for net interest income. Remember, JP Morgan, it has had such a run up because it had 6 consecutive years of record revenue. So always the question is, what's next? What more can we get? The other problem is on expenses. They raised their expectation for the year's worth of expenses. It's a weird one, right? Because JP Morgan is one of the banks that actually has increased headcount, whereas many are shrinking headcount. And so they have an FDIC assessment, they have costs tied to compensation, technology, and marketing. On one hand, JP Morgan spending means JP Morgan fighting to be competitive and stay in the market. But on the other hand, inflation, costs are up.
All right, let's talk about Citi, because Citi initially out of the gate, we saw gains and actually a rally here. Talk to us about Citi, which showed a profit beat.
Unlike JP Morgan, Citigroup really entered the season with really the toughest valuation. They were trading at roughly 60% of their price to book value. So pretty cheap here. But you have Jane Fraser really showing her ability to be relentless. You love that word. It was the first words they used in their presentation, relentless execution. You're seeing that because the first phases of the job cuts that they've done and the managerial changes, which were significant.
Right.
Thousands of jobs.
Big changes that Citi's been doing by Jane Fraser.
Massive changes. And remember, this is a big ship to move. Citigroup was the second largest employer of the biggest banks. Tens of thousands of jobs more at Citigroup than there were at Bank of America, for example. It was the second largest behind JP Morgan. So for them to have already made these cuts and have said, hey, the progress is there, we've done it, now let's you focus on other things at Citigroup, which includes trading, investment banking.
Okay, what about stuff that, comparing to JP Morgan, net interest income at Citi, for example?
Listen, it was stable. Something you have to think about here is as we kind of turn, the provisions for loan losses, I think this is what you might have been alluding to earlier, both at Citigroup and at JP Morgan were less than expected. So credit quality is really holding up.
Well, that's what I found interesting about JP Morgan's results. They ended up essentially saying, okay, lower income consumers, they're not that they're taking on more credit, they're actually just pulling back on spending. That's what we're seeing, at least.
Yeah, they're pulling back on spending, and really, it depends on how you look at it also. If you look at Citigroup, for example, the branded card revenue was not up by that much. And remember, Citigroup has a massive credit card business here as well. The other area where you saw just a bit below expectations when you came to Citigroup was this wealth business. And the reasons they attributed that to was a decrease in NII, net interest income, also affecting wealth business now, lower deposit spreads, and higher mortgage funding costs. So wealth is a big focal area for Citigroup, but it also shows you even in the wealth business, when you think about lending, these are wealthier consumers, right? There are even some questions there.
How much of Citi's earnings beat was just because they have been cutting costs so much and we're starting to see the impact of that?
Well, that's one big thing, but they also beat on some pretty remarkable businesses. That is fixed income trading, equities trading, and in underwriting in investment banking. And the reason that's so remarkable is because they've changed the leadership at each of those businesses. Coming out of the pandemic and when Citigroup was really grappling with a lot of regulatory changes, a lot of folks on the street were really worried about how much balance sheet they'd put to work. Jane Fraser is saying, we still got it. And so for her to turn around those businesses in the middle of, frankly, a lot of change at the top, including at those very, very businesses. Some people have not even taken the roles yet, Carol.
That's
and
interesting.
She's still
beating. What do we need to know on Wells Fargo, just quickly?
Same kind of story here. Where do they get that NII from? It's why you're seeing the weakness in the stock.
There's a theme.
There's a theme here. And again, this is going to follow us through. If you looked at it, really the whole KBW bank index.
Yeah.
I think maybe now the whole thing is lower. Citigroup was one of the only stocks outside of State Street up on the day. But we were
23 or lower, one gain. Yeah. So you've got, State Street.
State Street. And they had positive results today also. And again, different type of NII trajectory there. But for the most part, people are worried about how this is going to feed through the banking system.
Shares of Wells Fargo down 0.3%, kind of
crazy.
bouncing around all day. Any concern about charge-offs for commercial real estate at Wells Fargo?
So remember, this is something they've been talking about for a long time. So you have to assume at this point that people have really priced a lot of that in. And remember, you have to look at the general percentage you're talking about for commercial real estate relative to the entire loan book. And that's going to get much more severe when you get to those regional banks.
All right, good stuff as always. Can you give me 30 seconds on Morgan Stanley? Anything we need to know about this investigation real quickly?
What will they say about it? They've been very silent. And the longer they're silent, the longer there are questions.
All right, it'll be interesting on the earnings call. No doubt about the focus has shifted. All right, Sonali Basak, thank you so much. All right, that's a look at what's going on when it comes to the big banks. We got to talk a little bit about, though, what's going on in the economy and what Fed members continue to talk about.
Yeah, today we got a read on consumer sentiment, slipping in early April by more than forecast, and inflation expectations increase, underscoring Americans' frustration with high prices. Making sense of the twists and turns and commentary, our own Michael McKee, international economics and policy correspondent for Bloomberg News. He's here in our studio, hot off a conversation with one of the voting FOMC members. We're going to get to that in just a second. First, though, Mike, on the data today, give us the high level and the low level.
Well, the high level is that people don't like inflation.
That we knew.
When you talk to the University of Michigan people, they note that the changes in the expectations for the economy and the overall sentiment about the economy weren't that large, but they did go down. We did get definitely noticeable increases in the expectations for inflation over a year and then the 5 to 10 year period. But that is pretty much all attributed, according to them, to higher gasoline prices, to higher inflation prices. But when you look at what gasoline's pretty much the only thing that came out of the CPI that everybody buys, because food prices were flat during the month. But it's also the level, as they say, of inflation. People still remember that, maybe it's not going up, but it's still high. So that seems to be the discontent with it. What was interesting is when you look at the political aspect of it, the Democrats were even happier with the economy. The Republicans were even unhappier with the economy. And Joanne Shu, who directs the surveys for the University of Michigan, said, "Get used to this. We're going to have this volatility all year."
Unbelievable, or not unbelievable, if you will. I want to ask you, though, about oil, just because we did see it spike today. We come off our highs nonetheless, but it's all with geopolitics. When that happens, I mean, how does the Fed look at something like that, Mike? Does it have to be a sustained trend line for the Fed to be a little bit more worried in how it complicates it in its fight against inflation?
It would have to be a sustained trend in both oil and particularly in gasoline, because gasoline is what gets into the consumer spending. They're concerned with what they call second-round effects in terms of oil. Gasoline consumers, oil's used in chemical production, oil's used in plastics production. It's used in so many things that if those companies have to pay more, then you'll have a problem. But most companies are hedged or buy out in the future in contracts, so it takes a while for that to have any impact. And then the bottom line is the Fed can't do anything about it. You can raise prices all you want, but it's not going to bring down, raise interest rates all you want, it's not going to bring down oil prices. So the Fed tends to look past it as much as possible.
Which is why it likes core.
Well, it gets into the core of the second round effects.
Yeah. Okay. True.
But they can't fix it.
Yeah.
How high does it have to go in order to get into core in a meaningful way?
I don't know that we have a specific idea on that. It generally, when you get to a little over $100 is when people start to say that it could put pressure on companies. But because we don't know about who's hedged and who needs to buy oil at these prices and how long it's going to last, it isn't clear exactly how that's going to play out.
Sometimes when oil gets up high enough, it makes sense for companies to either reopen spigots somewhere where maybe that didn't make sense on a cost equation. So like it can work its way out.
The other question is, when do people stop spending money because they're spending more on gas? Right now, people are complaining because they've noticed gasoline prices have gone up. But generally, the rule of thumb is that gas prices have to hit a new high before it really affects consumer behavior, because they get used to paying more.
Right.
When prices went, now they're maybe, I think it's something like $3.54 a gallon national average. When it was down at $3.03, that's still over $3. But people are like, oh, hey, gasoline prices went down.
But $3 in 2024 for a gallon is not $3 in 2016 for a gallon.
No.
These are not inflation-adjusted numbers that we experienced at the gas.
No, and when you look at, I think you could go back to the 1990s for prices roughly equivalent kind of thing today, and you go back to the 1960s, 35 cents a gallon might, I mean, I haven't done the math, but could be about where we are today anyway.
That's what I'm trying to say.
But nobody cares about that. They just say,
that's not what they're thinking. That's not what they're thinking when they're at the pump.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Susan Collins, president of the Boston Fed. You caught up with her. Tell us about that conversation. We have a little bit too we want to play for everybody, but tell us a little bit about what you wanted to know from her or what you felt like was top of mind.
Well, the most important thing is that she and all of her colleagues have basically been saying, we can wait now. We don't have to act right now. And I want to know if that was a turning point. The markets are treating it like a turning point in Fed policy. And she said, no, it's just a reaction to the fact that we don't have to move because the economy is doing okay.
Yeah.
And we don't know what's going to happen. And I asked her, and she said, we don't have an idea of what's going to happen, so let's wait and see what's going to happen.
Well, let's take a listen to a little bit of that conversation from earlier this morning with Boston Fed President and voting FOMC member Susan Collins.
I don't see urgency, and I see lots of reasons for patience. And over the longer term, I think my expectation is that we will ease and that over the longer term, interest rates will be at lower levels. My baseline would still have us starting to ease later this year, but when I see is likely to be later than I had been previously thinking.
All right, obviously Susan Collins from the Boston Fed, president there. You know, Mike, I just do wonder, is the Fed kind of be able to kind of push this after the elections, and so that there's no question about like being political, like obviously that's not their thing.
You talk to them, they all say, no, it's not gonna matter to us. We'll do what's necessary. However, when you look at the argument that the economy doesn't need rate cuts right now, if nothing changes, it's not going to necessarily need rate cuts in September, so they have a good reason to hang back, unless the fact that Donald Trump says he'll fire Jay Powell. That just causes Powell to change sides, but I don't think he would do that. I'm sure he would not do that.
And bottom line, the economy's still growing, just quickly.
The economy is still growing. It's somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. It's bounced around with the latest data.
As Jay Powell said, U.S. economy, it's good.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things. All right, until we hear from him at the next Fed meeting. Mike McKee, Bloomberg News International Economics and Policy Correspondent.
Hey, taking a look at markets right now, the S&P 500 off lows, but still lower by 1.4%. The NASDAQ lower by 1.6%. The Dow down 1.2%. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Is bracing for an unprecedented attack by Iran on government targets. S&P right now down 72 points. That is a drop of 1.4%, bouncing off the bottom, but the Dow now lower by 470 points, down 1.7%, and the Nasdaq Composite Index is down 263. For Nasdaq, a drop right now of 1.6%. 10-year at 4.49% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.87%. Spot gold now down $21 the ounce to $23.52, lower by 0.9%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, $85.93 for a barrel of WTI. Beijing has ordered telecom carriers like China Mobile to replace foreign chips in their core networks by 2027. This, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing sources, it does deal a potential blow to American chip makers Intel and Advanced Micro Devices. Intel down 4.5%, Advanced Micro Devices lower by 4.4%. At the Masters, a windy day today. Bryson DeChambeau topped the leaderboard at 7 under par. Denmark's Nikolai Højgaard and also Max Homa and Scotty Scheffler, all 6 under par. Tiger Woods, 1 over. He's attempting to make the cut for a record 24th time. Recapping stocks lower. S&P right now down 71, drop there of 1.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, it's been a most read story on the Bloomberg all day today. It's a Bloomberg exclusive reporting on how Israel is bracing for a direct and unprecedented attack by Iran on government targets as soon as Saturday, tomorrow. This is according to people familiar with Western intelligence assessments. It's a move that has the potential, Tim, to trigger an all-out regional war.
Yeah, as Charlie just mentioned, we've seen markets move on this news, oil moving higher as well. With us, we got Hagar Shamali, who spent more than a decade in the U.S. government working in national security and public affairs. She's founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies, joining us from Greenwich, Connecticut. Hagar, good to have you with us this afternoon. In terms of an increase just in this war, an increase in escalation, what would that mean if we did see Iran do an unprecedented attack on parts of Israel in the next few days?
Well, it would be a very significant escalation, to say the least. And I want to note that I am not an alarmist. I've worked on numerous crises in the Middle East specifically, and this whole time for the last 6 months have been saying, don't be alarmed by that, don't be alarmed by this. That's not going to be the thing that triggers a region-wide war. But an attack by Iran proper, meaning not its proxies, not Hezbollah, not Hamas, an attack by the Iranian government inside Israel's borders would not only escalate things between Iran and Israel, because Israel is certainly not going to sit back and not respond to that, whether or not, however this was triggered. They're not going to sit back. That's not part of Israel's military playbook. But on top of triggering something wider between Iran and Israel, Israel is surrounded by enemies, including many who are backed by Iran, obviously, and armed by Iran, like Hezbollah. The IRGC is sitting in Syria, Hamas, and so on. They're surrounded by these enemies. But the fact is that Israel is an ally of the United States. And so, but when you have the United States going out there and trying to share this intelligence publicly, that is a strategy on the part of the U.S., in particular the Biden administration, by putting this out there, is to put Iran on notice, to say the U.S. is watching. Don't forget that the U.S. could also come to Israel's defense.
All right, so we have talked, Hagar, a lot about how Iran has kind of, like to some extent, that the U.S. has been distracted by the war in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, because it's allowed it to do what it needs to do with Russia, whether it's sending oil, and it's gotten kind of the Russian-Ukraine war kind of off the focal point, if you will, when it comes to geopolitics. Having said that, does that tell you anything about what Iran might want in terms of, or how severe a response that they might do in terms of retaliation? In other words, might they be like, okay, we like that the U.S. is distracted, but we don't want to get into a confrontation with the United States?
Well, you make an interesting point. As a rule, these dictators, like the one you have in Iran, China is the same. They like when the United States is distracted by another war like that one in Ukraine, because they know that U.S. resources are going to Ukraine. But as a result, I mean, the U.S. government can walk and chew gum at the same time, and the Middle East is obviously right now consuming a lot of the U.S. attention and resources anyway. Iran has two main goals, and its main goal on one hand is, well, it's a really one main goal, which is to expand its influence across the Middle East, to really be the one in power, to be the regional hegemon. And U.S. presence in the Middle East is a big pushback against that. So they want U.S. presence out, and they view Israel obviously as an extension of the United States, which is absurd, but that's how they view it. And that said, Iran knows it's not going to win a war, not only with Israel, but it's not going to win a war with the United States either, which is what has tempered Iran so far, and why Iran has relied on its proxies, because they don't want typically something direct. And you can see that play out not just in the last 6 months, but in history over and over and over again. Let's not forget, the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani. That is way bigger than the commander who was killed in Syria. And Iran vowed to retaliate. They plotted these assassination attempts against former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the former ambassador to South Africa, Lana Marks, and the plots were thwarted. And that's because Iran is very unsophisticated in its implementation. Now, you don't want to play that hand too hard, because they could get lucky. But that said, Iran does tend to understand its limitations, and does not want to protract and fall into a massive war where they go to the United States.
They don't want a World War III?
That's right. They don't want a World War III because they would lose.
Okay.
Well, that said, Hagar, and I know you said you're not an alarmist by any means, but help us game this out, given your experience working on this stuff. Let's say there is an attack on Israel over the weekend or in the next few days. What would be a way that Israel's allies, perhaps including the United States, could respond?
Well, one of the first things you'll see is Israel will likely respond in kind with attacks on some kind of Iranian military infrastructure, whether it's within Iran's borders or not. But I mean, if I were Israel and knowing Israel's military playbook, Israel has never been the kind to just sit back and respond in a way that comes off as though it's a weaker response. So they would, if Iran attacks Israel within its borders, Israel will attack Iran within its borders, and probably something in kind like a military infrastructure or something like that. At the same time, though, what you're going to see is the U.S. probably deploy warships in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf in particular, to tell Iran, hey, don't let this escalate further, because we, the United States, could get involved. We don't want to get involved, and you've heard the administration say that talking point over and over again, right? We don't want to expand the war. We don't want to make this wider. But the U.S. also, this is an ally of ours, and while that alliance does not have, it is not written that we would come to Israel's defense. It's really more based on a calculation. If it seems that Israel's survival is at stake, then the U.S. would come to its defense, and that's the message the U.S. is going to try and get across. response.
Hagar, what about other Iranian allies? What about other players or countries or agents, if you will, in the Middle East? How they might react as well?
At the moment, the only one really that poses a significant enough threat to Israel that could take on this fight for Iran is Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. But again, what you see so far, and I would expect you see maybe an increase, but then it would die down again, is because you've seen these strikes going on between Hezbollah and Israel back and forth. And the reason it hasn't escalated to the point to a full-out war is because it is in both sides' interest not to have it escalate to a full-scale war. And that's kind of what I expect now, is that Iran, if Iran indeed does go through with its strike, which the U.S. has put out there very loudly, then I would expect Israel to respond and the whole world to communicate to both. Okay, now you've responded to this situation. Now please let the tensions calm down a bit. And we have seen Iran respond to that. When the U.S. struck 85 targets 2 months ago in Iraq and Syria against Iran-backed groups, Iran told those groups to cut it out, and they did. So Iran is aware of its limitations. So it wouldn't be surprising if you see things escalate. If Hezbollah goes crazy and takes this fight on, that's where you could see this escalate very widely. But all the parties have an interest in doing something, but not letting it get out of hand.
One thing I want to ask you, and I just want to take a couple of steps back, if I may, because what set this off in motion is Iran saying that Israel was responsible for the attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria. We were just talking, I mean, if that's the case, right, I'm not quite sure that it's truly been confirmed, but having said that, why would Israel have done that? Did they know? Were they looking to kind of, poke around? Like, why would they have done that?
Well, so a few things. So, right, it hasn't been confirmed yet, but it wouldn't be surprising if it came from the Israeli government. But it's also the thing, to be honest with you, I have been surprised, having worked on the Middle East for so long and having dealt with these wars. This is a pattern of behavior that we believe the Israeli government has pursued, including within Iran's borders. There was a scientist who was assassinated only a couple years ago that was assumed to have been Israel. And it was, again, neither confirmed nor denied, but it was so sophisticated, the attack, that many people believed it was Israel. And so this one I understand is a diplomatic compound, but how that's different from Iran's borders, within Iran's borders, I don't know. And again, assassinating Qasem Soleimani, that was a significant move. This is the man who has been behind the terror in the Middle East for the last 30 years. And that was even more significant. But this one, sorry, continue.
No, bottom line, because we're just running out of time. I mean, 20 seconds. Nonetheless, you're unnerved. You're a little bit on edge because of what's happening. And someone who's watched the region for a long time.
Yeah. Yes, I would say an Iran strike on Israel makes me unnerved. Yes, it is. I'm not alarmed. Yeah. I'm not alarmist, but it would definitely be a significant escalation and very, very risky.
All right. Really appreciate you weighing in. Hagar Shamali, she's founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies, joining us here on Bloomberg Business Week.
Hey, checking the markets as we get about 90 minutes from the close right now. The S&P 500 off lows of the day, but still down 1.6%. The Dow down 1.4%. The NASDAQ Composite, Carol, down 1.7%.
Yeah, and we've seen investors with these geopolitical concerns, these rising tensions once again in the Middle East, as we just talked about. You have seen investors seeking out safe haven assets, including gold, although we've seen gold pull off some of its higher levels. We've seen the dollar, though, move up as a result, and we see investors moving into U.S. Treasury. So yields have backed off a little bit. Right now, that 10-year note just below 4.49, so just below that 4.5% mark as we speak.
Hey, let's get to Washington, D.C. now for a check on the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Tim. Israel is on high alert, as you've been discussing, and prepared for a retaliatory attack from Iran. Local media is reporting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been meeting with his top officials to consider their options. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby on the U.S. preparations.
We're talking about an attack on an ally and a friend and a partner, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that they have what they need to defend themselves.
Kirby refused to say what retaliatory actions the U.S. could take if Israel is attacked by Iran. President Biden's administration is set to forgive almost $7.5 billion in student loan debt. The plan announced today will affect an estimated 277,000 borrowers. Almost half the total cost would go toward people enrolled in the Save Repayment Plan, which the president announced back in 2023. This is on the heels of another Biden plan outlined this week to forgive the student loan debt for about 4 million borrowers, including those who face financial hardship. Speaker Mike Johnson will be meeting with former President Trump later this afternoon in Florida. Today's meeting has been billed as a major announcement on election integrity and to tout legislation that would prevent non-citizens from voting, even though that is already illegal. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Another thing that startups need to look for is a market that is either started to undergo or is soon going to undergo exponential growth. I think this is actually related to one of the biggest mistakes investors make when evaluating startups. Investors always say, well, what's your growth rate? We care about the growth rate. Investors will forgive smallish revenue today if it's growing quickly. For some reason, people don't think about markets this way. But if you think about the most important startups, they are the ones that I start in small markets that are growing very, very quickly. 11 years ago, the market for iPhone apps was $0. It's now huge. And I think if you only think about the TAM today, you'll make a big mistake. What you really want to do is identify a market that's going to grow every year and be able to ride that up elevator.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
But it's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. what does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are very close to session lows again on the S&P 500 index, looking at a loss right now of 84 points, down 1.6%. S&P's on track for a losing week as well. For the week, the S&P is down 1.6%. The Dow now lower by 537 points at 37,919, down today by 1.4%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 295 points. For NASDAQ, that is a drop right now of just about 1.8%. 10 years yielding 4.49%. The 2-year, 4.87%. Spot gold down 1.3%. The precious metal now at $23.41 the ounce, was trading above 2,400. West Texas Intermediate crude advancing 0.6%, 85.51 for a barrel of WTI. United States Steel shareholders have voted in favor of that $14.1 billion takeover offer by Nippon Steel, leaving the fate of the deal for the iconic American steelmaker to the realm of regulators and politics. U.S. Steel down today by 2.8%. ADRs of Nippon Steel, they are up by 0.2%. Again, recapping losses for stocks right now, with the S&P selling off by 85 points, down now by 1.7%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, appreciate that. Well, among our most read stories on this Friday is, of course, what we just talked about, how Israel is bracing for an unprecedented direct attack from Iran. Stocks here in the U.S. definitely under pressure because of those war jitters. All of this happening as we kicked off today another U.S. earnings season. There's a lot going on, you know that, with the big banks reporting earlier this morning their commentary and those from the C-suite to come as we go through the quarterly earnings season here in the United States, what they say about the economy, what they say about the outlook in markets. Tim, that's going to be really important.
Yeah, with more on the C-suite view and priorities and stresses, back with us is Rich Lesser, Global Chair of BCG, also known as Boston Consulting Group. He's here in our studio. Rich, good to have you with us this afternoon. Hey, before we get into the 3 big challenges that you see global CEOs having right now, weigh in on geopolitics, because certainly front and center today, and I think no question, a lot of business leaders are thinking about what's happening around the world right now.
Absolutely. And I would say it's not just today. You obviously see it today in the stock market data and other things, but and the stresses, but it's been this whole year. I've talked to a lot of CEOs, and it's interesting how much risk has flipped over the last year. If you go back a year ago, people would have said the first risk was the macro economy, inflation or unemployment risk, recession. The second risk was U.S.-China and a deteriorating relationship. And the third was geopolitics and politics more generally. A year later, it's upside down. The top of the list is politics and geopolitics, 2 wars that seem intractable right now. U.S.-China has dropped, but has at least plateaued. So it's still a big concern, but it's at least a bit more stable than it was. And the macroeconomic risks are still there, but in a much narrower range now, I think people are feeling, than a year ago. So you're right. What's weighing on companies right now are things that are really beyond their control around what happens in this political situation, what happens in these wars, geopolitics more generally.
Listen, CEOs are trained and paid to deal with stress. We know it, right? And when it comes at them from all levels. But would you say that CEOs in the C-suite is more stressed or are more stressed than they were 6 months ago or a year ago?
No, I would say this whole decade has been one source of stress after another.
Yeah.
To me, the really interesting comparison is we've almost come to expect this level of uncertainty and disruption and risk, starting with COVID and supply chain and inflation and U.S.-China and wars and now all the political division. I think CEOs forget how much, not that it was easy, not that there weren't challenges, but how dramatic a change this is in the dynamic nature of the range of risk. And then you've got other challenges like climate change and other things over the last 4 years.
Well,
okay, go ahead, Carol.
No, I was going to say, well, because you've been kind of thinking about what's top of mind when it comes to CEOs. Walk us through some of them, because I know you shared some of the notes. Something we talk a lot about is generative AI. Sure. Is that really, top of mind? I feel like it comes up in every conversation. I feel like it's safe to say that the C-suite and others are really still trying to figure out what it means for their businesses. But how are they looking at it?
So it is top of mind. I would also highlight that a lot of them are still trying to figure out how to ensure in a world where they have less pricing power, where growth still is okay but not great, they create robust near-term businesses. But generative AI is just hanging out there as the fundamental change on the horizon. And it's only been a year and a quarter since this technology really got highlighted as a huge opportunity. Right. So many are still in a learning mode, but that learning is shifting from learning what the technology is to learning how to drive fundamental impact in their businesses. And that's a different question. And what we're seeing is people are increasingly recognizing that the tools, the generative AI tools, are powerful, but if you're going to have business impact that's powerful, it's about combining multiple things together. You need those tools, but you need predictive AI, you need proprietary data, and you need a massive focus on the people and organizational aspects of this change process. And just the tools alone get you 10 or 20% productivity, but you need to get the 30 to 50%, you need to put a bundle of transformation elements together to get the true value and potential
Sounds
out
like
of
they're
those.
trying to figure out a lot of stuff.
Well, that's what I want to ask you, because this is something that we talk about all the time, which is, okay, we've all played around with ChatGPT and the image generators as well, but I want to see how this affects how companies are using this to pad their bottom line or increase efficiency or come up with new products and services, and I just haven't seen that yet.
Oh, I think we're really starting to see it. If I take the insurance claims processing area, most, and what you can do to take what were 10-day processes to review claims and approve them down to a day. If you
I will say they are not passing those savings on to customers right now with insurance prices.
And I'm not promising where the savings are going to go. Like, that's a separate question when you get the savings. But I think whether it's insurance claim processing, whether it's clinical development, report writing or designing a protocol for a clinical trial used to take months and months. You can take massive amounts of time out of that. When you look at software writing, only 30% of the software companies were using sort of the GitHub type capabilities that exist. When you input those in, all of those are 30 to 50% productivity opportunities or more, but only if you combine the human aspects of it, you put some predictive AI alongside the generative AI, you leverage your proprietary data. It's not just a simple hand people a tool and savings pop out.
I want to get to an aspect that's also, you say, top of mind and top of the agenda for CEOs right now, and this has to do with cost management as a lever for transformation. And what's interesting is you get into, I think we talked about Citigroup, right, going through transformation, and they've let go a lot of workers as well, but that things like physical downsizing, headcount reductions rarely generate sustained savings or growth because companies are not addressing the root causes of cost creep. And that according to a recent survey that you guys did, 34% of executives said that freed costs crept back within 12 to 18 months. So, all right, what is the cost management or cost cuts that are transformative for a business?
I think I'm so glad you raised that. There's this classic approach, tell everyone they need to take out 10% or something. And what we see over and over is when you just give people a target and say hit a number, they find a way to hit a number, but they hit it in ways that are not sustainable and it creeps back in. If you want to make this real and lasting, it's much more of a fundamental look at what are the dynamics in the organization, where is there work happening that doesn't need to happen, where do you embed tools and technologies, not just generative AI, even traditional technology and digitization tools that allow you to rethink processes, take on harder topics like supply chain and manufacturing and procurement, not just, administrative overheads.
So really thoughtful.
And use that. And those more thoughtful approaches are not just more impactful, they're much more sustainable, and often create revenue opportunities too.
Yeah.
Because too many layers in an organization is not just about cost, it's about slowing down innovation, stifling, change from happening.
Rich, we only have 30 seconds left, but give us something on climate change and the way that you think CEOs need to prioritize this.
Well, first, I came back from the West Coast. I've been there 2 weeks. The number of exciting climate technologies that are coming forward right now is really great. It's a different discussion. I know we don't have much time. I think this will be a quieter year for new announcements, given the elections underway, how divisive this is becoming. So right now, CEOs should be obsessively focused on how they're going to deliver on the commitments that they've made and where they can go further. And probably the announcement parts are going to wait till after we get through this election season.
Really interesting. And maybe we buried the lead, because I do feel like if we don't get climate under control, many would argue, right? You don't get that under control, and not much else is going to matter. Rich, thanks for stopping by. Really appreciate it. Rich Lesser, Global Chair of BCG, of course, Boston Consulting Group. And speaking of the C-suite, Mickey D's coming up with an interesting plan.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that after this. In the meantime, we're still seeing the S&P 500 lower right now by 1.6%, the Dow down by 1.4%, the NASDAQ 100 down by 1.9%.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Bank earnings front and center today. Right to the numbers here, because we got J.P. Morgan Chase down 5.75%. It reported net interest income that slightly missed analyst estimates and raised its expense guidance for the year, sending shares lower. Now the firm earned $23.1 billion in net interest income in the first 3 months of 2024, up 11% from a year earlier. It still expects to earn about $90 billion from the key revenue sources sources here, but lifted its guidance, excluding the markets business, to about $89 billion. CEO Jamie Dimon cites a number of risks going forward, including wars, growing geopolitical tensions, persistent inflationary pressures, and the effects of quantitative tightening. Again, JP Morgan Chase down by 5.7%. Citigroup's profit topped analyst estimates as corporations tap markets for financing and consumers leaned on credit cards. Citigroup shares lower today by 1.8%. Also out with earnings this morning, Wells Fargo, it missed estimates for net interest income in the first quarter, a sign that muted loan growth and increased pressure to pay out more for deposits are eating into the benefit of higher rates. Wells Fargo lower by 0.5%. Beijing is ordering telecom carriers like China Mobile to replace foreign chips in their core networks by 2027. This according to the Wall Street Journal, citing sources. It deals a potential blow to U.S. chip makers Intel and Advanced Micro Devices. Right now, we have got shares of both chip makers trading lower. Intel down now by about 5.5%, whereas Advanced Micro Devices is lower by 4.8%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. For that, we go to Washington, D.C. and our 99.1 newsroom where we find Nancy Lyons. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. Sources tell Bloomberg Israel is bracing for a direct and unprecedented attack by Iran on government targets. This could happen as soon as tomorrow. It's a move that has the potential to trigger an all-out regional war. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters the U.S. is doing what it needs to do in the region.
We are making sure that we can protect ourselves and our facilities, as well as doing what we have to do to help Israel defend itself.
National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. Iran blames Israel for a deadly strike on its diplomatic compound in Syria last week. Iranian leaders have said Israel would be punished. A growing number of drugs are in short supply around the country. That's the word from pharmacists who responded to a survey by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists and the Utah Drug Information Service. The survey found in the first 3 months of the year there were 323 active medication shortages, surpassing the previous high of 320 in 2014. Adderall, used to treat ADHD, is among the hardest to find. The popular new class of weight loss drugs, including Wegovy and Ozempic, do not appear to cause a heightened risk of suicide or self-harm. That's the conclusion from the European Union's drug regulator, but drug makers will keep monitoring the drugs closely. At the Masters this afternoon, Bryson DeChambeau and Scottie Scheffler share the lead at 7 under. Tiger Woods is tied for 37th at 2 over. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Tim and Carol.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. Nancy Lyons in D.C. We are keeping a watch on the markets. As we've said, you've got stocks pretty much bumping around their lows of the session. So still down about 81 points on the S&P 500, down 1.6%. NASDAQ 100, a decline of 1.8%. This has to do certainly with those geopolitical concerns that we've been talking about here at Bloomberg, in particular over the last couple of hours, and really concerned about what will happen potentially over the weekend between Iran and Israel. Iran expected to do some kind of retaliatory strike against Israel, and that's because they blame Israel for that attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria. So nonetheless, we're seeing certainly a safe haven trade, and we're seeing a risk trade that is off on this Friday here in the United States.
We're also seeing shares of McDonald's down by about 0.5 percentage point right now. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because our One More Thing focuses on what McDonald's is doing to try to innovate around kind of dealing with this new minimum wage law in California that recently went into effect that hiked minimum wage from $16 an hour up to $20 an hour in a very short time, so up 25%. And it's got franchisees very worried about margins.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure I understand why they're doing this. But anyway, it's a fan favorite that they're bringing back, and that's bagel sandwiches. They've been reintroduced at McDonald's locations in California as a plan to boost store traffic. They're spending $15 million on on local advertising. It's rare for a company like this to invest in promoting its products in a single state, so that's rare for McDonald's to do, but they're doing this, as Tim was mentioning, to cope with California's mandatory 25% pay bump. So I guess they're assuming it's a favorite, it's going to bring more people in, but why did they get rid of it?
Yeah, you raise a really good question. If it's a fan favorite and if it brings in foot traffic, then why was it not on menus to begin with, or perhaps why is it not on menus anywhere? So I think that raises a good question. But what it does show is that you do have the company very concerned about the increase in costs. I mean, 95% of McDonald's in California are franchisee owned. And one franchisee who spoke to Bloomberg News told us that this could cost as much as $250,000 more per year.
I'm guessing we'll hear more on the earnings call, the upcoming earnings call with McDonald's. All right, for those of you watching in TV, the close is up next. Tim and I continuing on Bloomberg Business Week on radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, let's get to it. We're just about 1 hour away from the closing bell, getting ready to wrap up the Friday trade and the trade for the week overall. We've got stocks pretty much at their lows of the session. We're going to talk about the equity trade, a sell-off, really kind of across the board. The risk trade, certainly not one that investors are interested in, Tim, on this Friday.
Yeah, taking a look at markets right now, the S&P 500 down 1.7%, the Dow down 1.4%, the NASDAQ 100 down, 1.9%, Carol. So we're continuing to see stocks move lower. Hey, one stock that was higher a little earlier in the day.
Yeah, kind of rallying, really.
A little bit. We'll see if it holds on to. Was Apple. Yesterday was up more than 4%, adding $112 billion to its market cap. This after Bloomberg's exclusive report on Apple's overhaul of its Mac line. We're actually joined by the reporter who broke the story.
Yeah, looking forward to digging into it with Mark Gerben.
Is Apple still higher? Is that going to be one of your gainers?
No, I was kind of hoping.
It is higher? Jess Menton says it's higher. Okay, so you're good, Carol.
It was up almost 2%. No, I stayed away from it because it's a rough market out there today, certainly equity market, or rougher than we've seen in some time. Also, we focus a lot on the U.S. economy. One group contributes trillions, yet is still very often overlooked to its gains that it contributes to the U.S. economy. The CEO of Coquel is looking to change that, so we're going to dig into that a little bit later on.
Plus the blockchain, Carol, we've heard for years that it's going to be useful.
For years.
For years? Is it? Are you all over the blockchain?
For years.
You're looking at your watch. Well, John Wu over at Ava Labs says that this is the year. It's going to happen soon.
All right, looking forward to that as well. U.S. Steel shareholders, approving Nippon Steel's takeover. That and more top of mind when David Weston stops by with a preview of tonight's Wall Street Week here on Bloomberg. So looking forward to what's coming up his way.
And it's Autism Awareness Month. We're going to speak to a financial advisor who's working to provide independent living for adults who have autism.
All right, first up, let's get back to the markets and a check on the trade with Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. We got a lot going on. Final hour of trading, 59 minutes to go until the closing bell. Got to keep it locked into Bloomberg Radio to see where things shake out ahead of what is likely to be a lively weekend. We have got the Dow right now down 561 points, a drop of 1.5%. S&P 500 index at 5110, trading lower now by 88 points. That is a drop of 1.7%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 309 points right now. NASDAQ down by 1.8%. Small caps lower as well, with the Russell 2000 Index down now by 2.2%. The 10-year 4.49%, with a 2-year 4.88%. Our Just Menton's going to have a whole lot more on the markets coming up in just a moment. Spot gold trading lower by $17 the ounce, down 1.6%. $23.35 right now on the precious metal. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, $85.47 for a barrel of WTI. Again, that 10-year 4.49%. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston President Susan Collins reiterates she sees no urgency to cut rates in the near term, given elevated inflation and the resilience of the labor market. And in an interview this morning on Bloomberg Radio, you heard it live, Collins said she is staying the course despite this week's CPI report.
It's premature to tell whether the elevated numbers that we just saw are a bump along that path or something more concerning. So I don't see it as a significant turn, but important to continue to look at the data holistically and let the data tell us what's really going on.
Federal Reserve Bank of Boston President Susan Collins. So again, recapping, stocks are trading lower today. Earnings front and center. JP Morgan Chase down 6%. Citigroup after earnings down 2.1%. Wells Fargo after earnings down 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet at that. Is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really do appreciate it. Well, you just heard some of the numbers from Charlie Pellet. We're seeing stocks near their lows with the S&P 500 down 1.7%, the NASDAQ Composite down 1.9%, the Dow down 1.5%. The global financial world roiled by a flare-up in geopolitical risks that sent stocks sliding, also spurring a flight to the safest corners of the market from bonds to gold and the dollar. Oil we saw move higher earlier in the session as well. For what we need to know, we turn to Jess Menton, Bloomberg News Deputy Team Leader for U.S. Equities. She's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Jess, a sell-off like this, I think, given what we've seen so far this year, is somewhat of a big deal. But also the context here is we're still up 7%.
That's
on
right.
the S&P 500. So I don't want to take this. I don't want this to get out of hand here.
Right, and from the October lows, the S&P 500's up more than it's around 25% since then. So this week on pace for its worst week of the year. If you do look at the S&P 500, so down about 1.8%. So that would be its largest weekly decline since it hit its low in October.
Okay.
So for some context there, but to your point, Tim. Stocks have been on a tear again this year on the back of, obviously, we have a resilient economy, corporate earnings. We just got the kickstart, of course, the banks this morning. And also have to point out that JP Morgan and a number of these other banks, had a strong first quarter. So coming into these earnings reports, obviously there were a number of different metrics. I know that everybody wants to look at net interest income, but you have to put in context the run that they had been on coming into these earnings results.
Interesting. I don't know. So then how are you seeing it? What are people that you're talking about? Obviously, we've talked a lot about geopolitics and what's going on in the Middle East here, and watching things like moves that we've seen earlier in the session, certainly into gold, into the dollar, we've seen oil rallying. All of these can change depending on what happens over the weekend potentially, or what happens next week for that matter. So I am curious what you are hearing from some of the experts that are watching this on a regular basis.
Well, what's interesting about this is if coming into the CPI report, because obviously that was something that came in a bit hotter than expected on Wednesday, but coming into that, there had only been about 4 different sessions this year where the S&P 500 declined at least 1% or more. And every time that's happened this year, people have come back into buy. That's what happened yesterday. So now people are wondering, when you have another decline like this of this magnitude, what happens Monday? And obviously that really shapes around what happens with oil prices when you have WTI trading around $85 a barrel. And then also, to your point, Carol, not just what's happening in the commodity space, but then the dollar is on pace for its best week since September of 2022. And then obviously we can't forget about the bond market and what's happening with yields. Even though we've seen the 10-year treasury come down a bit, it's still trading at 4.5. So that is around its highest level since the end of last year. And it's still below an uptrend that it had broken at the end of last year. But that's something that's problematic specifically for stocks. So if you have that going on in the bond market, if you have that going on in oil prices, and then obviously other corners like that, that's going to pressure equities.
Any of the folks you speak to, Jess, seeing an opportunity to buy right now, or are they waiting for things to move lower potentially?
Well, what's interesting, because y'all were just mentioning Apple earlier, and I'm glad you brought that up because that was something I was going to bring up. So AAPL is a ticker symbol on this, up about 0.4%. And I had done a story coming into this new quarter, basically as the calendar was flipping, about how Apple was so pressured compared to the S&P 500 and the underperformer in the Mag 7 stocks. And at the time,
I remember was $170 a share. It was a really important
it was around,
number.
so 166 was, and 165 was the support level for the October lows. And it got as low as 167 earlier this week during CPI, but you saw that bounce off. And what I had told y'all at the time with my conversation with portfolio managers were they were looking to kind of, what their clients wanted was to shift, say if they had exposure to NVIDIA after, I mean, that stock's still up over 70% year to date, but if they needed to trim exposure going into a new quarter after that, some of them were looking to shift some of the underperformers for the Mag 7, and that included Apple. So the question was, would you see more of that as we got into the second quarter? Obviously, we're only a couple weeks in to the new quarter, but you are seeing a bit of that. And then that safe haven trade, of course, everybody always wants to point to quality and companies that have strong cash flows, and we all know Apple is one of those.
Exactly. And we talked yesterday about a story. I forget, was it JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley?
JP Morgan came out and said that hedge funds were looking to buy Apple.
Yeah, that they were looking at Apple because of, kind of how much it had been beaten down at this point. So it is interesting. At some point, right, some somebody's got to look at the balance sheet and say they sell a lot of stuff.
Right.
They've got a lot of cash on that balance sheet.
Buybacks is notorious for that.
Exactly. So you do wonder. All right, great stuff. And we'll see how ultimately we go as we get towards the close. But right now we're pretty much at our worst levels of this session. All right, Jess Benton, thank you so much. Deputy Team Leader for U.S. Equities at Bloomberg News. So interesting in terms of, some of the activity that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm also wondering to what extent some potential folks out there are saying, okay, wait a second, we've seen a market move higher by, in the first quarter, let's say roughly 10% for the S&P 500. So far, this quarter, that number is now down for year to date to about 7% gain for the S&P 500. This is, we still think the economy looks really good. We're just ahead of earnings season. If these companies perform and put up good numbers, Carol, then potentially we could see a leg higher.
Yeah, I think, and that was what Gina Martin Adams was pointing out in terms of, we are expecting earnings growth when all the numbers come in. So certainly important.
We're going to be speaking to JJ Kinahan a little earlier, or a little later today. And, in preparation for that interview, one thing that he ended up saying was that it's all down to earnings because we have no idea what's going on with the Fed, basically.
All right. Well, speaking of earnings, Apple's going to report on May 2nd. So not to get too ahead of us, we've got some time. But nonetheless, we are focused on Apple following a move yesterday up more than 4%, a little bit higher today. We've been kind of bouncing around on Apple shares, but rallying yesterday after a Bloomberg exclusive report that the company plans to overhaul its Mac computer line to focus on artificial intelligence. That story, by the way, added $112 billion in market cap value, the stock's best performance, Tim, in nearly a year.
That story written by none other than Bloomberg News chief technology correspondent Mark Gurman, who joins us now from Los Angeles. Mark, congratulations on another great scoop. We were trying to come up with some sort of scoop machine nickname for you a little earlier when we were preparing for this. But I think Mark works for now. Give us an idea of what exactly Apple is going to do in this revamp and to what extent it demonstrates that, hey, they actually are making this bet on AI.
Yeah, so the real news here is that Apple's accelerating its chip development. They're coming out with the latest chips, the M4 line, 1 year after the M3 line hit the market last October. That's interesting because in prior years, you had about a 1.5 year to 2 year upgrade cycle on the Apple Mac processors. So that's the big news here. Now, in terms of the new functionality, there's two things. One, better memory support. So you're going up to 0.5 terabyte of memory on the Mac Pro. Right now, you're at a little under 200 gigabytes. And what that means is you can run more things at once. It's great for pro users and video editors. The other thing is they're enlarging the neural engine. The neural engine is the AI component on that chip. And so you'll be able to do AI operations, LLM operations at a faster rate.
So this is more about the chip than the revamp on the Mac computer line, or you kind of roll it all together?
You roll it all together. The two go hand in hand. You're not going to see any major computer redesigns for this generation. The next swath of upgrades for the Mac, other than the Mac Mini, are going to focus on the current designs and improve performance and tweaks to their displays and whatnot. You're going to see a new iMac in October, which is exciting. You're going to see a new Mac Mini in both an M4 and M4 Pro configuration. So that's interesting. And then next year is when you're really getting the goods, which is going to be like an M4 Ultra type of chip. That's going to be for the new Mac Pro at the end of 2025. So they are moving quickly, and they are really upping the performance of these things. They've essentially destroyed Intel in terms of PC performance, and they're really putting up good numbers against AMD and NVIDIA in terms of graphics chips as well.
That's what I wanted to ask you, Mark. How does all of this move the needle, on the balance sheet? I mean, it's already got a pretty amazing balance sheet. We know that about Apple, but how does it move the needle financially?
I don't think it does. I was surprised, to be quite honest with you, about the stock market reaction. I wasn't anticipating that. This is not going to move the needle for Apple, I don't think, in any considerable way. The Macs have long had AI processors. This is about how they're going to position it and how they're going to market it. This is about improving those AI processors, bringing new on-device machine learning and AI services to their devices, not only the iPhone, the iPad, but the Mac and the Apple Watch and the Vision Pro as well. You'll get to see some AI-ification across the next 3 years. That's what the roadmap calls for. These are going to be minor speed bumps. Last year, you got a big upgrade to the GPU, the graphics side of the engines. This year, you'll get a bigger focus on memory and the CPU, which is the overall operating speed. But I still think the Mac, the story has been told on the Mac. It is about a $7 to $10 billion a quarter business. You're not talking about the Mac suddenly growing in terms of revenue by 50, 75, or 100%. So certainly to the bottom line, this does not make a considerable impact. And then in terms of monetization of AI, the monetization of AI that investors should really be excited about is how it could be monetized on the iPhone. That is the bigger user base. The Mac user base, of course, is quite considerable compared to some other consumer electronics, but it's not the holy grail when you're investing in Apple.
Hey, Mark, I'm wondering about use case here for the typical buyer of one of these Macs. I mean, if we think about who's using these for Gen AI, I got to imagine it's kind of a small number of maybe power users here. I mean, who are these computers meant to appeal to? Because I know that, based on my own use, what do we use computers for these days with iPads and iPhones in our pockets or in our homes all the time, that really necessitates a chip this powerful.
Yeah, but we have to understand is that for now, AI is a buzzword, just in the same way that 5G was a buzzword. I challenge you to name one thing that your iPhone with 5G could do that your iPhone without 5G couldn't do. Yeah. So I'll challenge you to figure out one thing I'll get back to you on that. AI chip. Yeah, right, can do that your current Mac can't do today. So it's about future-proofing, but that story of what that future is yet to be written. And so the hope is at the developer conference in June, you'll start to see some things that would be benefiting from higher-end AI engines. In my case, I believe the AI engines in the existing Macs are pretty good. But Apple knows AI is the buzzy term. AI knows what the investors are looking for. Apple knows that consumers are looking for that AI-ification. So even if the Macs today do a pretty good job at processing machine learning, the new ones are going to do a slightly better job, and they're going to promote the heck out of it.
Mark, this week we've not only seen the news that you broke on Apple's new chips and the new Mac lineup, but we also saw a new chip from Intel, new chip from Meta Platforms. The story there, they're all just trying to take on NVIDIA. This is a wild question, but is there any chance that Apple would ever sell its chips to customers outside of Apple?
Yeah, I don't foresee any scenario under the current management or current board or current ethos of the company where they would sort of license out or sell their chips. One interesting thing is many years ago, they worked on a project to do cloud-based CPUs. And instead of using third-party CPUs, using AWS, Google, you name it, they were looking at the idea of using their own cloud hardware and cloud infrastructure. Now, that project didn't go too far, but you could imagine that it would have been pretty good for the company if they stuck that one out. And, it could have been a potential revenue source down the road if they were to license out that processing engine to third-party providers. But here's the thing, Tim and Carol, Apple has a user base so big and on its own that maybe it would be impossible for them to support their own customers plus customers of, Google, Amazon, you name it as well.
Really interesting. I always feel like, when we think about Apple, like the success that they've had in making their own chips, like who'd have thought maybe a few years back that all these guys would be off doing their own thing. But what does that success tell you maybe about more broadly about the chip industry and maybe some of the threats to come?
I want to take this question in a little other direction.
Sure.
And I do touch upon the end of your question, actually. The one thing people are not talking about enough in terms of Apple's chip business is the lack of diversification. I mean, right now, 100% of Apple silicon is produced in Taiwan. Who knows what the geopolitical situation is going to be in Taiwan in 1 year, 10 years, let alone one day? And so the question is Apple able to get TSMC and other chip manufacturing fabs to diversify in other places in the world before there's a situation in Taiwan that knocks out their entire supply chain for processors? And so the bet is that Apple gets there before something happens to Taiwan. The hope, obviously, is that there is always going to be peace in the world, but we know that is not a reality. So certainly the race is on to diversify.
Really good stuff, as always. Really appreciate it, Mark Gurman. Take the weekend off, okay?
No chance.
I know, I'm sure you never do. All right, Bloomberg News Chief Technology Correspondent Mark Gurman joining us from Los Angeles. Taking a look at Apple shares. Tim, they've been bouncing around today.
Yeah, Apple shares bouncing around, but we don't see major indices bouncing around. The S&P 500 near session lows right now, down 1.7%. The Dow down 1.5%. The NASDAQ 100 down 1.9%.
All right, you're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Steep losses for the U.S. stock market, trading at the lows of the day right now, with the S&P 500 index down 85 points, a drop right now of about 1.6%. Dow Industrials down 538 for the Dow. That is a drop right now of about 1.4%. The Dow at 37,922. The Nasdaq Composite Index is down 304 now, a drop there of 1.9%. 10-year, 4.50%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.88%. Spot gold down 1.4% now, $23.39 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, $85.43 right now for a barrel of WTI. Big banks and financial services providers among the leading decliners today after earnings. JP Morgan Chase down almost 6%. Citigroup down 2%. Wells Fargo lower now by 0.8%. Well, as for the overall market backdrop and those banks, Anastasia Amoroso is Chief Investment Strategist at iCapital.
I'm not surprised that investors are having a bit of a difficult time parsing through bank earnings because there's not a clear-cut story uniformly positive or negative across all the different sectors of the banks. And the negative story clearly is the net interest margin and kind of lack of improvement they're forecasting there.
Anastasia Amoroso of iCapital Network. ExxonMobil has formally approved its 6 Guyanese oil development that will make the Latin American nation a bigger crude producer than OPEC member Venezuela. ExxonMobil shares today, they are lower. Right now, we have got ExxonMobil down by 1.2%. Again, recapping, stocks are declining. Lows of the day, S&P down 85, down 1.6%. Checking what's happening at the Masters, Bryson DeChambeau and Scottie Scheffler tied atop the leaderboard at 7 under par. Tiger Woods tied at 27th, 1 over par. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, last month we reported on how billionaire Steve Cohen's Point72 Ventures, it's part of a group of investors who are betting that blockchain tech can be used in the U.S. to simplify vehicle registration. So Point72 Ventures led a funding round for a company called Champ Titles, Carol. It's a startup that's working with several state governments to replace existing vehicle title registration and lien systems with a digital system featuring blockchain technology.
Cal, sign me up for someone who has to go get a new title or replace another copy of a title for a car. Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
dreading.
I have to find my marriage certificate.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to do that. Yeah, it's very weird.
Good luck. Blockchain, it could come in handy.
Yes, hold on to your marriage certificates, I'll say that.
For advocates of the technology, car registration, just one of many uses, but we think about this a lot. This is blockchain, I kind of understand. John Wu is one of those advocates. He's president of Avalabs. He's the developer of blockchain project Avalanche, and he argues that we'll soon see quick adoption of blockchain technology. He joins us from New York. John, good to have you on with us again. So how are we thinking about blockchain? What are you seeing in terms of it really being put to use? Because I do feel like we have been talking about it for a long time. I'm going to say at least a decade already.
Well, it probably is about a decade, but probably a little bit less because the programmability on using a smart contract on a blockchain really started with Ethereum. So, you know, Bitcoin is not as programmable. It is really more of a store of value, and Ethereum's only been around for less than, call it 10 years. So that's when it's really started happening. But utility is hard to understand because there's a lot of B2B stuff. And even what you just mentioned with the DMVs having cars register on a blockchain, that's a use case that makes perfect sense. That's the blockchain aspect of it. And I think the states that is leading the way on that is state of California and their DMV. They are really, I think they already said they want to put all the title of cars in California on a blockchain within a very near term in the future.
Hey, so how is that different, John? Explain to someone listening right now who's saying, wait a second, how is that different from just, you know, having a database in the cloud of every vehicle registration? Like, how is it different when it's on the blockchain?
So this database is shared by everyone. It's immutable, and everyone can see what's happening. So first of all, the reason to use it is it will save costs because you don't have to replicate databases for every point of access, for every person needing their own version of the ledger, if you will. So it will save you the system money, if you will. It'll make the workflow far more automated and save excess, operating expenses in that way. But more importantly, I think in this case, the fact that it is immutable and transparent, it makes it easy for people to audit and check and the provenance of who owned what auto. What you are afraid of in this non-trustless world of single servers is that whoever has control of that server can actually change information on that server by accident or for nefarious means. On a shared blockchain, you can't do that because everyone can see what's happening.
Well, how would it work? So help us understand. So if I needed to get a copy, or I wouldn't have to get a copy of my license is what you're saying, or my car title, because it would just be on the blockchain. But how would I access this? And who would be overseeing that blockchain?
That's a good question. So that's the user side, the user interface side. I mean, you can also replicate this with your house titles, the same concept. Right now, when you buy a house, you need to change ownership. You go to town hall, and at town hall, it's actually paper-based, if I think most places, and they literally show you paperwork of who owns, and then they add your name to it. So the user interface in this case will still be controlled by, I guess, a municipality or a state, a public entity, so to speak. But the underlying information will be stored in a way that, in theory, all municipalities can all get access to it and look at it. And even I can actually look at it if I am savvy enough to create an interface to search into the blockchain.
Okay, I would imagine there are some more exciting uses for blockchain than DMV. But Carol wants to keep talking about it. Go ahead.
I just one more question. So,
DMV is very exciting. Imagine if you save yourself time of going into doing all this stuff. I mean,
would it save me time? Would it save me money though? If I still had to verify something, would I still have to go to the municipality's blockchain or talk to somebody, and they would have to say, "Oh yeah, it's here." Would I have that easy access or no?
Well, presumably it will save the municipality money to put it this way, put it on a blockchain over time. And whether they want to provide access to everyone, I think in this case it's a hybrid solution where they still control some point of access. Okay. But if they conceptually wanted to open it up and expose the blockchain, everyone can see it.
So they could still charge me, basically.
Yeah, they got to get revenue from. They got to pay.
Looking for seamless.
Got to pay those employees.
Taking costs out of the equation.
Yeah, not like we talked about earlier. Maybe the savings aren't being passed along to the customer.
Maybe not.
Okay, John. I want to talk a little bit about some other use cases here because you argue that we could see lots of uses when it comes to gaming, consumer loyalty, and on-chain finance. I want to start with on-chain finance here. Explain to us because this is not just something that you're talking about here. I mean, we got BlackRock's Larry Fink talking about this as well. Tokenization. So talk to me about what's exciting to you when it comes to finance in the blockchain.
So the number one use case right now happening in the financial world is tokenizing of what I call real world assets. And that's either tokenizing money market funds, the US dollar, or actually a private equity fund. So I think the one area that people will absolutely agree that there's some product market fit, if not already has product market fit, is the stable coin. So even PayPal is trying to create stable coins. There's a lot of this happening in different industries. And in fact, I think Brevin Howard did this analysis where last year there were more stable coins settled on blockchain or as much as the Visa network. So basically, when you can create that efficiency, you save money. And even PayPal, they're allowing US customers using their stablecoin capability to send money overseas. And when I spoke to them last, basically, if there's 4 parts of creating a stablecoin, it's and allowing people to transfer the money around the world, they haven't even completely integrated the entire workflow. But yet, what they've integrated, called half of it, has already makes it a more profitable transaction. Another great example would be sticking with PayPal. PayPal owns the PayPal wallet and Venmo. They bought in Venmo and Braintree. It's a different, construct, different tech stack. And if you have a wallet at PayPal in Venmo and you have a PayPal wallet, if you want to move your own money, $100 from PayPal to Venmo, you see $100, so it's seamless to you. But in the back end, really what happens is it's subsidized by PayPal, and only 99.9 gets moved, and they put the extra 10 cents in there for you because they have to go outside the system, integrate different tech stacks, move things around, go to a third party, and it just costs money and the friction there costs money.
Yeah, I would assume that whole industry, right? We know they're looking and watching because you just think about how much. I've got a daughter overseas, and just the movement of monies and the mechanics
that is
between
so hard to do.
Bank here and opening a bank there because it makes more sense. Like, it's just crazy. And she's become real savvy about who's charging fees and stuff, and we try to figure it out.
You just got to do it in Switzerland, Carol.
We're on Bloomberg right now.
Well, I mean, if you remember, like 5, 6, 7 years ago, people who did remittance was using Bitcoin, because it was save them 15% instead of going to Western Union or one of these places.
Right.
The only problem with Bitcoin was just too volatile. So now the stablecoin construct is a better one for moving money back and forth overseas.
Well, John Woo, I'm looking for, I can't wait till I don't have to go to DMV anymore. Sorry, DMV, but there's got to be a better way. And I understand how maybe blockchain can make it simpler and make more sense. John Woo, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
John Woo also big on Twitter. I don't know if you saw, he tweeted, when he tweets, mentions you on Twitter, you get a lot of responses.
John, can you mention us a lot more? We would really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, John. Good to see you.
Be well.
Hey, I do want to check out the S&P 500 down 1.6, so we're off of lows as we head into the close. The Dow down 1.4%, the NASDAQ Composite down 1.8%.
All right, let's get back to world and national news. For that, back to D.C. and the one and only Nancy Lyons. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Carol. The U.S. Embassy in Israel is warning its staff to stay put for fear Iran will retaliate for last week's deadly strike on Iran's consulate in Syria. President Biden was asked about the threat just a short time ago.
We are devoted to the defense of Israel. We will support Israel. We will help defend Israel, and Iran will not succeed.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has assured his Israeli counterpart the U.S. will provide support against any attacks. And Joint Chiefs Chairman General C.Q. Brown tells CBS Mornings he's talking with his counterparts in the region to try and prevent any attacks.
We're really trying to avoid war, and this is part of the dialogue that I have with my counterparts within the region, to include the Israeli Chief of Defense, who I talked to yesterday. And we're doing things not only to prevent a war, but at the same time, one of my primary things is to make sure that all of our forces in the region are protected.
Sources tell Bloomberg an assault is expected to come as soon as the next 48 hours. Russia is apparently receiving components to build cruise missiles and drones from China. That's the word from senior U.S. officials who say the supplies are allowing Moscow to ramp up defense production in its war against Ukraine. There is no evidence, though, that China is providing lethal assistance. The House has advanced a 2-year extension of Section 702 of the FISA Act. The initial legislation called for a 5-year extension, and the FISA Act does allow the U.S. to surveil foreign targets. It now heads over to the Senate. Longtime PBS News anchor Robert McNeil has died. He was 93.
Still to come on the News Hour, what's ahead in Bosnia and rethinking affirmative action.
He was the co-anchor of the McNeil-Lehrer Report and the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour for over 2 decades. We're also just hearing Italian fashion designer Roberto Cavalli has also died. He was 83. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got 20 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Steep losses for the U.S. stock market. We are on track for a losing week. Let us head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. U.S. stocks under pressure from the start today amid 6% losses in J.P. Morgan after earnings and worries about the Middle East. The Dow is currently down 562 points. S&P's dropped 88, while NASDAQ is down by 1.8%. The U.S. 10-year yield at 4.51%. Gold falls 35. Oil still in the green, but Bitcoin is falling by 5%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, all were trading in the red, led by losses in materials and tech. Leaders to the upside in the Dow, Apple and Travelers, while Intel and J.P. Morgan led to the downside. Also, after earnings, BlackRock fell 2.5%, Citigroup dropped 2.2%, and wrapping things up, semis dropped on a report China has asked its telecom carriers to start phasing out foreign chips. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. Have a great weekend. Lots of moving parts to today's trading, and to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type SQUA, S-Q-U-A, on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, just about 18 minutes left in today's trading session. Charlie, of course, just breaking down the numbers here along with Bill Maloney. We've got stocks pretty much at their lows of the session, but some of the definitely a risk-off trade, certainly on the equity side of things, but I feel like some of the safe haven trade, we've seen that dial back a little bit.
Yeah, we got a great guest. Let's drive to the close with JJ Kinahan, CEO at IG North America. It's the parent company of the options, futures, and stock trading platform, Tasty Trade, as well as the global Forex trading platform, IG. He's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio.
We wouldn't let him leave.
Along with Bill Maloney, technical analyst at Bloomberg, because sometimes you just got to have Bill Maloney stick around.
Well, we just kind of wanted a roundtable because it's been an interesting day. And JJ, let's bring you in first of all. In terms of, we've seen pressure, we've been talking about geopolitical concerns. How do you guys see it? How are you thinking about what's happening today?
Well, I don't think it's, it started obviously with Mr. Diamond's statements this morning, I think, which took everybody by surprise in terms of the fact that, normally CEOs say, hey, here's our one standard deviation plan in terms of there's one or two things out there that could give us some headwinds, and we're planning for that. Basically, he said today, there's like 7 things that can happen, and we're not sure which one to plan for. So that threw the market off a little bit to start. And, we've seen sort of a follow through with different geopolitical news, et cetera, is one of the things he brought up as a risk overall. In general, I don't think this is unhealthy for the market to have a bit of a sell-off. It's where it goes from here that really matters.
So, Bill, come on in on it. You've been watching it kind of, I don't want to say tick by tick, but it does feel like tick by tick that you do. The moves that we've seen, because it wasn't so negative earlier this morning or pre-market.
Well, it has been a tick-by-tick day, and the only time people want to talk to me is on days like today. But the one thing I will note with the S&P is testing and thus far holding its 50-day moving average, and that's the first time since, I think, October, November. So the 50-day moving average down to 51.11 right now. It's at 51.20 is the key level today that we're watching.
All right, so we're right at it.
And we're right at it.
So, Bill, what are the folks who are getting in touch with you asking? What do they want to know?
Basically want to know is where the buyers might step in. And right now the 50-day has been, we took out some key levels earlier this morning. Yesterday's low and the day before, which was Wednesday's low, that was key support. That fell. When it fell, it went right down to the 50-day, and right now we're holding it.
Well, speaking about buyers coming in, we've been talking a lot about, JJ, Apple, and buyers moved in a big way yesterday. We've talked a lot about our Mark Gurman story, but are you, or would you suggest that investors, as we see this little bit of a pullback, start to step in?
It's really interesting. If I look back to 2020 and in the dip, if you remember the buy the dip mentality every time we went down, it always started with Apple and Microsoft. What's really been interesting to me is over the last few times, it has not been Apple. It still continues to be Microsoft. Yeah. It's actually been Microsoft and Meta where we see people go to. So I think it's very interesting
When
that
they dip lower.
when the buy the dip mentality takes over, those are the two stocks people tend to start with. This is the first time we've seen Apple be one of those stocks in the last 16 months.
So what's that telling you?
What that tells me is that perhaps the fear around Apple is a bit overblown in terms of maybe some of the things we're seeing in China, particularly on the back of the news is what is happening to the chip makers. Maybe Apple isn't going to be alone, and that might be okay for them longer term. And also, at the end of the day, Apple's still an amazing franchise, and people are still, going to step up in there.
JJ, that news you're referring to,
Amazing
we're seeing
franchise and a great balance sheet.
we're seeing chip makers lower today as a result of a Wall Street Journal report that said that China has asked its telecom carriers to start phasing out foreign chips.
This is something you've been watching or
Right,
talking
so
about.
AMD is very weak today. Intel is down 5 or 6%. So the chip makers, NVIDIA is down big as well. So they're all weak today, basically off the headline. They all started moving as soon as that headline hit, probably 3 or 4 o'clock this morning.
What are we looking at in terms of the stocks right now? And let me just pull it up real quickly. I mean, we've got the stocks down almost 3%. So it's pretty much, it's a little bit off its lows. It was down 3.5% its lows, but nonetheless across the board here.
And that's something you may find buyers pop in, like if there's nothing, if the weekend is quiet, there may be some buyers on the open on Monday.
What do you make of, Jess Menton was in earlier, our deputy team leader for U.S. equities here at Bloomberg. She said the S&P 500 on pace for the worst week in 2024. You mentioned about 5120 on the S&P. This would be the worst week since October 27, 2023, which is when we saw kind of stocks take a recent low, right? And from there, we were up about 27% from that October low till now. So if it is the worst week in 2024, what's the significance of that?
I think Bill hit it right on the head. What happens this weekend? If it's a quiet weekend, you have to remember one thing. We're seeing VIX still up over 25%. It's still below.
Low.
That's exactly my point. It's still below 20.
Yeah.
It's not flashing a terrible warning sign. It's saying, okay, we had a sell-off for the first time in God knows how long, since October, really, of this significance.
Right.
So the market probably, to stay healthy, needed a bit of a sell-off. If we do break, as Bill talks about, this 50-day moving average into the close, that would be a really bad sign. Or if we have some bad action this weekend and we start on a very negative note on Monday, that would be a bad sign. But if we hold that level and the weekend is relatively quiet, I think it's probably one of the really healthy things for this market.
Bill, how do we know if this sell-off is actually the start of something bigger or if this is just a temporary pullback?
Well, we've been weak all week, right? So, and I want to see the S&P hold the 50-day moving average. We talked about Apple. There's a chart that I wrote about last week on how Apple was testing relative to the S&P. You talked about the level back in October. It tested there and had a rip your face off rally this week off that level. So that is a key level we're watching in Apple, and how it trades relative to basically the S&P. And right now it's acting very well. It's one of the best performers today. It's still up, I think.
It's interesting.
Can I say one thing,
Yeah,
Bill?
please.
Every trader loves that you just use the word "rip your face off." And every trader
Everybody
uses
just
that
kinda laugh at
expression,
that.
and every trader loves that expression.
Hey,
Not quite a Bloomberg
JJ,
function yet, but
I
to
do
be.
want to get into a few of the stocks that you sent our way because you have a great view on what whereas there's bullish and bearish activity. You mentioned Meta Platforms. Still seeing bullish activity there.
Well, all this week we have seen Meta be one of our more bullish stocks. Normally if you look at retail flow, retail is about 55% buys, 45% sells. I don't know, it's still pretty close to 50-50 actually.
Yeah.
We have seen 75-ish, 80% almost of Meta activity over the last week be bullish activity. So that's really unusual. When you get above 60 to 65% buying activity, that's also unusual, and we've seen that. The two stocks that stood out for me were that and GE. GE has been for almost 3 straight weeks. People cannot get enough GE.
Wow.
I have to say that I do,
Blast from the past.
I have to pull up the gainers, and GE has been atop that list.
What's old is new again?
And all the
exactly-
industrials have been great, but GE in particular, what do you feel about the spin-offs?
And GE Vernova is the other one, too.
GE Vernova had a great week.
Yeah.
Talk about the parts being greater than the sum. Look at GE Healthcare.
Right, GE
GE's
Healthcare.
doing well. GE Healthcare has been a dynamo since it's spun off. So all of the parts are doing well. So, I mean, was it mismanagement? Was it that they were so big it was just hard to manage? Whatever it may be, this looks like it was a really good move to break up these things into different areas.
Maybe investors just kind of want to understand what a company is. And I feel like that clearer, cleaner vertical play sometimes makes sense in terms of an investment thesis.
Absolutely. I think the company that is headed maybe that way, but is still a dynamo, is Amazon, because there's a business there that's always doing well.
Real quick, if we see buy into the close, which we're starting to see, is that a good sign?
Yes, absolutely.
Bill Maloney?
Same here.
All right, we'll see what happens, folks. Got about 10 minutes to go. Thank you so much. Our own Bill Maloney and JJ Kinahan, Chief Executive Officer of IG North America, in the house. This is Bloomberg.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stage ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them, did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger, but drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that, we'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the firing line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
To Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, just under 5 minutes left to go before we wrap up the Friday trade and really the week overall. As we heard from Jess Metten, while we are off our lows, you know, the S&P 500, we have seen it on pace for its worst week here in 2024, worst week since October 27, 2023, which, if you recall, was a bottoming out of the S&P 500 and was the beginning of a 27% climb to its highs back in March on the S&P 500. But, Tim, a different tone today.
A different tone today that was really set off over geopolitical concerns. War jitters fueling a rush to bonds. We saw oil rally earlier. We saw the dollar also move. But Carol, as we just heard from JJ Kinahan and Bill Maloney,
yeah.
If we don't see Iran strike Israel's government targets over the weekend, we could see stocks move higher on Monday.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. Obviously the geopolitical tensions, and we've certainly seen it in a risk-off trade, and we've seen investors, you know, moving into the safe havens of things like gold, like the dollar, certainly the Treasury, U.S. Treasuries, because we've seen yields backing off as well in a week where we once again, that hot inflation print sent yields higher above 4.5%. We are right now, I should say, at 4.50% on the 10-year. It was a little bit higher, certainly earlier in the day and before the market opened. So it'll be interesting, and obviously the world is watching to see what happens in the Middle East and what it all means.
Yeah, and look, I will say, you mentioned we're up 27% since those October lows, the last time we saw a week like this. Just so far this year, Carol, we're up 7.3%. And then in terms of you know how far we are off from record highs on the S&P 500, we're only down 2.5% from those, which were reached back at the end of March.
Yeah, and in a week where, I mean, earlier, a day where we saw crude oil here in the United States up about 2.7% overall, but for the week we're overall lower, and we are, excuse me, when it comes to the oil trade, definitely off the highs of the session that we saw. So it's the back and forth, the volatility, but even then on the VIX, even though we've seen volatility come back into the market, we're still way down, and nothing like we've seen in other moments of crisis, if you will, way down, in fact. So
the big question, what happens with earnings? Because
that's a big part of it.
Really kicked off today. What happens next week?
Fundamental stories. That's going to be important, and what the C-suite has to say. Do not go anywhere. We're heading over to our TV colleagues. That's because Beyond the Bell, it starts right now.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick alongside Alex Steele. We're counting you down to the closing bell, and here to help take us beyond the bell. It's a global simulcast. Scarlett Fu in Studio 2, Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec in the radio cage. We welcome our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, including our partnership with YouTube. What's setting up right now, Carol Masser, to be the broadest base sell-off that we've had all year, though on a percentage basis, not quite the worst.
Yeah, check it out too. Jess Metten was in the studio, or the cage, as you like to call it, Romaine, earlier today, and saying the S&P 500 on pace for its worst week in 2024 and its worst week since October 27th of 2023. If that date sounds familiar, it should, because that was the bottoming, or recent bottoming, if you will, of the S&P 500 and what began a 27% climb in the S&P 500. So we're all a little bit on edge here as as we watch what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, it hasn't been a great week, but I will remind people that we are still up more than 7.3% on the S&P 500 so far this year. We're only down about 2.6% from all-time highs reached at the end of last month. Still, geopolitical concerns do have certainly have investors on edge.
Yeah, those geopolitical concerns are really hitting EIS, which is the ETF that tracks Israel, down for a fourth straight day, losing 2.8% right now. And we're also seeing weakening in the Israeli shekel as well, when everyone's just kind of on tenterhooks waiting for the headlines.
Yeah, and you can really see that reflected in gold earlier, right? You had that move to 2,400, and then we had sort of a sell-off, which, I mean, that's the point of gold. You buy it when you're scared, and then you also sell it when things get bad. So you can make the argument it's doing its job. So still part of that safe haven narrative, Romain.
A couple days ago, it looked like the major equity indices here in the U.S. were headed for a weekly gain, but based on where we stand right now, we're setting up here for weekly losses across the board. All right, we get the closing bells here in New York. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is going to finish out the day down by almost about 475 points. It takes a while for these numbers to settle, but nevertheless, the damage is done. Down 1% here on the day, 2.5% on the week. The S&P is going to finish lower by about 76 points, or 1.5% on the week and on the day as well, while the NASDAQ Composite down about 1.6% here on the day and about 0.5% on the week. But keep an eye on the Russell. At one point, it did trade below its 2,000 level. A key line in the sand for a lot of technical traders out there is going to close slightly above that at 2,003 and change, down about 39 points, or 1.9%.
All right, Romain, you said it well. A risk-off trade certainly on this Friday session. If I look at the S&P 500, folks, most of the names in the index trading lower today. Scarlett, 460 to be exact. We'll get into the sectors in just a moment. 41 gaining some ground, 2 unchanged.
Yeah, if you look at the sectors, it's pretty much red across the board. There's one pocket of green, and that would be in real estate management, but the main 11 sectors are all down. The worst performers here are materials, tech, and consumer discretionary, each off by at least 1.5%.
All right, I'm going to say it wasn't easy to find gainers, but got a little assist from my partner in crime here, Tim. So among them, first of all, an IPO, go figure. Maybe not a day that you want to begin trading, but nonetheless, UL Solutions, ticker ULS, did just that, and coming out of the gate and pretty much holding on to its gains here in its first day of trading, up 25% here. This is a safety testing and inspection company. It did expand its IPO. It raised $946 million. The pricing, though, within the marketed range, but nonetheless, out of the gate, really strong in a day where, as we just talked about, pretty much so many sectors, almost everything was down here. Also, Globe Life, Tim talked about this yesterday. It got hammered, down 53% in the Thursday trade, a record decline there. A different trade today. It was up about 20% after that sell-off yesterday. We know the news. It was a short seller, an anonymous short seller, Fuzzy Panda Research, released a report against Global Life, but nonetheless, investors coming back into that name today. Speaking of insurance, Allstate, also a gainer in today's trade, just up 2% at its highs today, finishing the day with about a 7/10 of 1% gain. Not sure why, but there were some analyst calls yesterday. Evercore, also Wells Fargo, raising their price targets on this company, so a little bit of a move to the upside. And one more name, Coupang. It's a $38 billion market cap e-commerce company, Korean e-commerce company, and it came out saying that it's going to raise the monthly fee for its WOW membership for new clients starting on Saturday, and so you saw that one really outperform in today's session, up 11%.
Okay, let's talk about some underperformance here because no shortage of stocks to choose from. I do want to start with JP Morgan having its worst day going all the way back to June of 2022, closing down 6.5%. This after the company reported that net interest income slightly missed analyst estimates, a sign that the benefit of higher rates may be waning amid pressure to pay out more to depositors. We should note that going into the report, shares were up nearly 15%. Shares up just a little over around 8% so far this year now after this decline. Hey, do you want to check on shares of chip stocks? Because we did see both Intel and AMD as well as NVIDIA move lower today. Intel fell more than 5%. AMD, for its part, fell 4.2%. This after the Wall Street Journal reported that China has asked its telecom carriers to start phasing out foreign chips. The direction went to China's largest telecom carriers earlier this year to phase out foreign processors that are core to their networks by 2027. This according to the Wall Street Journal, who cited people familiar with the matter. And then finally, let's take a look at how Boeing ended up doing today after what I think it's fair to say a pretty rough week for the company. What's that?
No, never mind.
No, 2.2%. down today. Down more than 7% so far this year, or so far this week, I should say. Having their worst run, guys, going all the way back to 2018, excuse me, back when its 737 MAX aircraft was involved in a deadly crash off Indonesia. Shares down about 60% from all-time highs that were reached back in 2019.
Ooh, that is a brutal stat. I'm taking a look at the bond market here. We know there's been a safe haven move into that. The 10-year yield, for example, is down 7 basis points. The 7-year down 8. But I have to say, yields were down more earlier in the session. Also, considering that big move that we got on the front end earlier this week, where you're up at 22 basis points in one session, this doesn't feel like a huge reaction that we could have had reversing some of the earlier selling, guys.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if I go back to even the equity trade today, to see that we kind of bounced off our lows and saw a little bit of buying into the close, I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just a counterpoint to that, though, too. I mean, I think one thing that alarmed me was just how much in lockstep we saw some of those safe haven trade, if you will, the idea that you had the VIX elevated, oil prices elevated, the dollar elevated. I mean, usually when you have the dollar go up, and then you usually get oil maybe go in the other direction, and then you play that in with the drop that we saw in yields, and then I guess that brief embrace of gold. I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is a little bit different than maybe some of the last big sell-offs that we had.
Yeah, we did speak to Hagar Shamali earlier in our program, and she said that, look, I'm not an alarmist here. She spent years working at the State Department. She said, I'm not an alarmist, but I am very concerned right now. All that said, guys, we could go the weekend and not see anything happen.
Can I say, I actually listened to that interview. First of all, it was a great interview, Tim. And then I'm glad you pushed back, because I actually found it alarmist. I mean, her tone, and I know that, you know, the tone that you're going to get from someone like that versus, say, an actual investor who maybe has a little bit more of a buffer is going to be different. But I did think that what she said about just the potential that this could be bigger, I guess, than maybe some of the previous incidents.
Yeah, I think escalation is certainly a concern. I mean, look, what could the U.S. do in response? And that's what she said. You know, she's essentially said, okay, well, we could see warships ending up, being deployed as a result of some sort of attack. But I think a lot of people want to avoid getting into something that could be considered, a widespread conflict.
She also, though, did also say that Iran knows its limitations and how much it can kind of push the United States. So they're going to be maybe thoughtful in terms of what kind of retaliation they do. So we'll see what happens this weekend. I mean, going back to kind of our bread and butter in terms of the markets, folks are saying, we had Bill Maloney and JJ Kinahan in here and said, again, if nothing happens, you could see investors certainly come back into the market. So we will certainly wait and see what ultimately happens and whether or not we get escalation to another level.
Yeah, so I was saying, like, if we don't see anything, do we get the buy the dip kind of scenario for that? Can we pivot here? Is that okay?
Can we talk bagels? That's allowed. And some other stuff?
I'm gonna move to some of the interesting stories that maybe didn't move markets, but are quite interesting and will impact how you maybe live your life, and that's McDonald's. So apparently, guys, you know this, that because California raised the minimum wage, McDonald's wants to get more people in the stores, so they're bringing back bagels to help them do that.
Yeah, they're doing that. Well, they're dealing with this, mandatory 25% bump in pay. So they're trying to figure out, okay, we've got to figure out how do we pay for this. And apparently, although Tim and I are kind of scratching our heads, bagels were a really popular thing at McDonald's, which makes me wonder, okay, who told them to take them away, first of all, if it brings traffic in. But nonetheless, because they know this, they did a focus group. They're going to kind of reintroduce them. And they're actually doing some marketing, which is what they don't normally do on a local scale.
Yeah, local marketing, just in California, spending $15 million there, which could be significant. I think a couple things to keep in mind here. One is it can end up costing a lot of money for these franchisees to pay these wages, these higher wages, $250,000 per restaurant. That's a lot of money. But everywhere is going to have to raise wages. So all prices are going to go up. Every restaurant is dealing with this.
All I have to say is bagels in California don't usually work out well. That's all.
There we go.
we talked about this.
She would be right. Bagels in New York, really good.
No, it's the water. The water's
Oh, come on. You're probably a pizza snob, too, aren't
you? Of course.
Yes. All right, on that note, that's a wrap, guys. Have a good and safe weekend. That's going to do it for our cross-platform radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We call it Beyond the Bell. We will see you same time, same place on Monday.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Well, a hotter than expected CPI print that spooked bond and equity markets. A flare-up, we just spoke about this, in geopolitical risks that sent stocks sliding, spurring a flight to the safest corners of the market. Also some big news in AI with new chips from Meta and Intel and an overhaul of the Mac with a focus on AI.
And some big news and maybe expected news, to say the least. About 3 years ago, U.S. Steel, 3 years ago.
Does it feel like 3 years?
It feels like 3 years.
Okay.
3 hours ago, U.S. Steel shareholders voting in favor of Nippon Steel's bid for U.S. Steel. We also have an earnings season kicking off. So there's a lot going on. It does feel like it's sometimes pretty dense and heavy. It is the backdrop for tonight's episode of Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Weston, airing tonight at 6 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and Television. David joining us here in studio. Yeah, it is a lot going on. We want to start with the U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel, if we may, only because we've been talking about with Joe Doe a lot this week.
All week, and it came up in the with the state visit too.
It sure did. It overshadowed
it really did.
Kishada's visit to Washington because it's a real bone of contention. And a lot of economists, Larry Summers, some time ago in Wall Street Week said, I don't understand why this is a national security threat. I mean, this is Japan. Japan's an ally. What's the risk here to this?
Why is CFIUS looking into it, right? When they're an ally.
And it may have something to do with U.S. Steel is based where? In Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is an iffy state in the election.
Are you saying
it's political?
Are you saying politics could be at play here, David Weston?
just conceivably.
Okay.
So on Wall Street Week tonight, we brought in Bob Zellick, he was the United States Trade Representative under George Bush 41. He actually started in the Reagan administration, and then he was head of the World Bank. But he feels fairly strongly this is politics, to your point, Tim. This is what's going on here. That it doesn't make sense as an economic matter, in part because, in fact, U.S. manufacturing production has gone up. The number of employees has gone down because the productivity has gone up so much. But his concern is actually there's just not enough of a difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump on trying to protect manufacturing jobs, and he thinks it's a mistake. This is part of what he had to say.
This is really an example of first time we've had two presidents that are economically isolationist in their policies back to back, and they're sort of competing to try to figure out how we can add protections. Now, in the case of the steel industry, Trump put on a 25% tariff that Biden kept in place. And so you already, if people ask about inflation, well, that gives you a pretty good example of why steel prices were going to go up. But this case is a little different. This case is Nippon Steel, a Japanese company, wanting to come in and buy U.S. steel, frankly, invest more capital, keep the jobs, add technology, add the competition. But the steel workers, who President Biden wants to court, have resisted, along with one other U.S. company that wanted to pay about half as much for U.S. steel and have a monopoly position. So it gives you an example of the politics now that is sort of running the economic and trade policies.
Yeah, and it's understandable. There's politics. It's an election year after all, and politics is not a bad word in a democracy. That's sort of how you decide things, right? It's through politics. But the real concern is, what are we doing to our economics in the meantime? Are we hurting ourselves? Not just not helping ourselves, but hurting ourselves with some of what they're talking about.
Well, I will say, for what it's worth, Joe Doe reminded us earlier this week, the former president, President Trump, said that he would kill this deal if he had been in power.
Well, and that's part of Bob Zellick's point. Is the problem is both of these people. And his basic thesis is they're living in the 1980s in a different era of manufacturing, and there's been so much that's changed. And why should we be upset that we're actually producing more with fewer workers, and the workers instead are going to higher paid jobs in more sophisticated parts of the business, such as tech? And why should we be upset with that? As he points out, the United States manufacturing exports are greater than Germany and Japan and India all put together. So our exports in manufacturing goods have actually gone up dramatically.
Well, what does he see as the longer-term implications of this? Since we have two candidates, or one president, one former president, one of them is going to be in the White House after November. Again, both of them isolationists. What are the long-term implications of that if they continue to carry out these policies?
Well, let me first just ask whether they really are as isolationist as you think, because there's a timing issue here, too.
Yeah.
I don't know, but as you say, former President Trump has said he would kill this deal. There are a lot of people who speculate, including some people within U.S. Steel, I have reason to believe, who think, if President Biden gets reelected, then after the election, this might actually go forward. So it's not a done deal necessarily.
Joe Doe has said that to us, too, at Bloomberg. He thinks that this isn't going to be decided till after the election. And so then we'll see, depending on the outcome, what ultimately happens.
Yeah, but the basic,
kind of interesting.
The basic point is we are in an economic competition with China, and I'm not sure that being distracted necessarily by manufacturing jobs right now, which at least Bob Zoellick would say this is a distraction, is going to help us in that competition.
What does he say about China and U.S. relations on that front when it comes to technology and high tech?
Well, he knows China backwards and forwards, because when he started in 1985 in the Reagan administration with Jim Baker in Treasury, that was his job, is to try to figure out the China trade thing. And he is the first to say, look, national security is a very different thing.
Yeah.
But as I said, it's a little hard to think a Japanese company owning and investing in a U.S. steel company is a national security threat. That's very different from high-end semiconductors.
No, exactly.
Hey, speaking of high-end semiconductors.
So then does he think the restrictions? I think it's amazing the trajectory in what, 20, 30 years we went from let's all in on China, right? And all the companies wanting to have some presence and work with them. There's so many different partnerships in terms of open facilities there. And then here we are 30 so later that we're just pushing back. It's a very different environment.
Yeah, we're pushing back at least, but I would raise the question whether some of that is from President Xi directly, because he made a priority, and a strategic priority, and even a military priority of high tech, and he became fairly unpredictable, at least to many investors, as to what he was going to like and not like. He drove some businesses to the brink. And so to some extent, I think investors are reacting to what they're seeing in China. It's hard to invest if there's not stability.
Okay, I want to talk tech.
Okay.
Because we had a big week when it came to AI, but I feel like we have a big week when it comes to AI every week in 2024. This week, Meta, Intel announcing new chips. We saw Mark Gurman's story yesterday on Apple's M4 processor, AI-focused. You spoke to Sam Palmisano for Wall Street Week coming up tonight. All about AI.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, he was head of IBM through a lot of transitions. And part of the reason we wanted him on is, okay, put it in a historical perspective. I mean, he was there for the conversion from mainframes to mini computers to personal computers, right? Not to speak of the internet. And he had some advice, actually. He said that, in fact, large tech companies want regulation. Those CEOs actually want regulation. They want rules of the road. But he made an important distinction that at least I hadn't thought of. You may well have. I had not. He said, regulate the use of the technology. Don't regulate the technology. Because when you try to regulate technology, you impair innovation. Let them innovate and then tell them what they can do about it. And that's the more effective way to regulate, from his experience going through several of these revolutions.
Does he trust regulators to get it right?
Well,
and understanding. I mean, I think that's some of the pushback that, like, does everybody down in Washington really kind of understand what we need to kind of regulate?
Is that a rhetorical question?
I mean, I think it's a fair question. I think to some extent it proves too much. You could say that about so much of what they regulate. And that could be with securities markets and all kinds of things.
That's true.
And in fairness to regulators, they're doing their best. They have limited resources, and they're up against some of the best minds in the world, whether it's on the tech side or the financial side, with people getting paid many times what they're getting paid. At the same time, he does have some confidence that they can do some sensible things if they think about it carefully, but they also can work with the private sector, because he in the private sector has worked with the government quite a few times to get some advice. He thinks if you work with the private sector to get some advice to get it right, you got a much better chance.
Okay. What else do you have coming up?
We're also going to deal with ESG. Remember that?
I love that you're having this conversation.
Nobody wants to talk about it anymore.
Now it's a bad word.
I know. We have Ann Finucane on. Remember, she was at Bank of America.
Yes,
she was in charge of this, and now she's at Rubicon Capital. And we basically said, what happened to ESG? What went wrong? And she has a lot of interesting thoughts about why it's not as badly off as you think. She thinks it's more about how we talk about it. At the same time, she thinks that some things have to get done. Particularly, we have to have some regulated markets, frankly, she thinks, to get this done, because the private sector will ultimately have to do it. The government's not enough.
Well, what's the goal of ESG? Is it about returns, or is it about kind of improving how we do things as businesses? Just real quickly.
Fair question, but I must say all the studies I've seen don't say you get worse returns. They just don't say you necessarily get better ones. If you can protect the planet without getting worse returns, that's not so bad.
David Weston coming up at 6 p.m. Wall Street.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. For the week, the S&P 500 index was down 1.6%. Today, equities saw their worst day since January after a news report that Israel was bracing for an attack by Iran on government targets. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all finished very close to session lows. Slight bounce heading into the close, with the S&P today down 75, a drop of 1.5%. Dow Industrials and the week headed into the weekend at 37,983, down 475 points, a drop today of 1.2%. NASDAQ was down 267 for the NASDAQ Composite Index. That was a drop today of 1.6%. 10-year at 4.51%, the 2-year 4.89%. Spot gold today down $28 the ounce to $23.44, a drop there of 1.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.6%, $85.52 for a barrel of WTI. Well, certainly bank earnings contributed to today's sour mood. JP Morgan Chase reported net interest income that slightly missed analyst estimates. It also raised its expense guidance for the year, sending shares down. And CEO Jamie Dimon cited a number of risks going forward, including wars, geopolitical tensions, and persistent inflationary pressures. JP Morgan Chase today down 6.5%. Citigroup today down 1.7%. Wells Fargo today down by 0.4%. So again, down day on Wall Street with the S&P down 1.5%. At the Masters, Bryson DeChambeau at the top of the leaderboard, 8 under par. Fellow American Max Homer 6 under par. Scotty Scheffler now 5 under par. And Tiger Woods, he does make the cut, will play the weekend. Tiger tied at 24th, 1 over par. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, April is Autism Awareness Month. The bioneurological developmental disability now affects 1 in 36 children. This according to the National Autism Association, which says that even though it's the fastest growing developmental disorder, it's also the most underfunded.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And we've got a great voice on this, and we're lucky to reach out to him again.
Charlie Massimo is a financial advisor at Wealth Enhancement Group who specializes in planning for families affected by autism. He's also the founder of Autism Communities, which provides independent living opportunities for young adults with autism. Charlie joins us from Blue Point, New York. Charlie, good to have you back with us. How are you?
It's my pleasure. I always appreciate you bringing me back, especially this month.
Yeah, we love it when you join us. Hey, I want to talk a little bit big picture here about what it means to be planning. I mean, everybody is affected by autism. I mean, like I said, 1 in 36 people are affected by this right now. How does it change the financial planning situation for someone?
Oh, drastically. I think what you have to understand, I raised 2 boys with autism. And, just the other day I met a client, she's 86 and she's still raising her 67-year-old son with autism. Wow. This is lifelong. Yeah. So for many of us, we have our children, they grow, they take care of themselves, they're out and doing their own thing, earning their own living. Not so when you're raising a child with autism. So not only do you have to figure out how do I care for my child with autism, and that costs, the estimate is about $2.5 million over the life of a child with autism. And how do I then fund my own retirement? So it's a significant challenge for these families.
Charlie, one of the things that I appreciate when you come on, and I think our whole audience does, is that you do give some insight into the world of autism and understand it from a level that most do not. Having said that, autism is a spectrum, right? And I do always wonder how many individuals are living with autism that are able to support themselves in some way or live on their own. How many are not? Do we have some understanding of that breakdown?
Well, it's a great point, Carol. And the thing about autism, sometimes you don't know what the capabilities of your son or daughter may be till later on. But to put it in somewhat perspective, 68% of the population of autism are unemployed for their entire life. 68%. Wow. So yeah. That's a pretty large number. And some of it is not due to their inability to work. It's just employees don't really understand the value or how to relate to them so they can be a valuable part of their firm or company. But the reality is 68% are not earning any money and rely solely on some governmental supports and whatever the family can supplement those needs with.
Well, as you mentioned, Charlie, the costs of caring for a child with autism ranges in the millions of dollars, can reach the millions of dollars over the lifetime of the child. If people don't necessarily have the financial means to do this, what are their options?
Yeah, great point. Again, their options are to understand the resources available. Fortunately, through Medicaid, there is a lot of federal funding. It takes some legwork, it takes some research, but there is a lot of money available through Medicaid, through Social Security. So the first thing I ask a family or tell a family, have you researched all the governmental entitlements that are available for your son or daughter? Because your point is well taken. The vast majority of the population can't afford $2.5 million to raise their son or daughter with autism, then figure out how to plan for their own retirement. So it's really, the entitlements are very, very important.
In terms of, I'm curious about kind of the working component too, like you said, that there's a lot of folks that maybe there are employers out there that, right, could certainly employ individuals with autism. How do we kind of figure that one out, that component, that piece?
Yeah, that's been a challenge for a long time. And there are companies like Microsoft, there are companies like Panera, and others that have found a way by, and this is where AI is going to become a big part for this population, because through AI programs, they're learning how to communicate with the autism population in the workforce. And I'm really excited about that component. But it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of training to support these young men and women with autism and how to fit them in. But I will tell you this, you talk to these firms that have employed those on the spectrum, and they all tell you they have a valuable part of the workforce, and they're incredibly productive when they learn how to communicate and learn how to assimilate them into their company.
Hey, Charlie, one thing I was really surprised to find when I was doing research for this is that, according to the National Autism Association, it's still significantly underfunded, even though it's increasingly common in this day and age. How do you explain that?
You know, Tim, right? If you look at the projections, next year it's projected that autism will cost this country $461 billion. That's about, what, 2% or so of the GDP. Wow. And you're right. It is probably one of the areas that the government is not looking at. I mean, there's only so many places you can pull from. And now what's happening is they're putting the burden back on the families, and they're saying, hey, we'll give you the dollars, but you need to manage these dollars yourself. And that creates a whole nother challenge in itself. But you're right, the government is not looking at this strong enough.
So Charlie, in your experience, since this started to be part of your life, has awareness increased? Has funding increased? Has a government understanding increased? Or has it gone the other way?
No, certainly awareness has increased. When my boys were diagnosed in 2001, I never even heard of autism. But now I can have a conversation with one person and bring up autism. They say, oh, I know somebody with autism. So awareness is significantly increased, and diagnosis has significantly increased. So those things are great, are happening. But again, there are parts, the financial aspect is just not being addressed in a strong enough fashion that it has to be, or this is going to become an epidemic for the country that's going to get ahead of itself, or get too far ahead of itself that we're never going to be able to figure it out.
Help me understand the financial aspect. Is it the overall cost that you find that we've got to kind of figure out? Because you do seem to say that there's money provided for individuals, but it's on the owner, then for them to kind of figure out how to do it all. I mean, if you could change a couple of things overnight, Charlie, what would you do?
If I could change, I'd make more of the
beyond
therapies.
No kids having to deal with autism, I'm assuming would be number one, but
yeah, of course. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But I think I would have more of these therapies, because what happens is once you get to the age of 21 and over 21, a lot of the services that were covered prior to 21 are no longer covered, right? So I'd like to see a lot of these health insurance companies realize that these therapies are lifelong. Speech, OT, PT. These are lifelong therapies that have to be part of these child or these adults' lives, and it's just not covered, or a lot of it is not covered. So the first thing I would do is look at the healthcare system and say, we got to address this in a much more aggressive manner. Then the second part, I would really figure out with HUD, how do we make affordable housing available? Because we can't have these young men and women living with their families until their families die or until their parents die. But depending on where you live in this country, it's just unaffordable for this to happen. So I will look at HUD to create better programs to make housing affordable for those with intellectual disabilities.
Well, that's where I want to end with your work that you've been doing at Autism Communities. Can you just talk a little bit about what you created? Wow, just about a decade ago at this point, Charlie?
Yeah, it's not just Autism Communities; it's so many other associations that we've been part of. But I think the goal is working with developers and taking these affordable units within these developments that they're building, and then setting them aside for those with intellectual disabilities. So instead of paying market rate, we've gone to the developers and say, can we reserve a couple of your units and put them for low income housing? And that certainly helps or goes toward making it more affordable. So we're looking to work with more developers to create more of these housing or affordable housing units for those on the spectrum.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, Charlie, so good to check in with you. Be well. Charlie Massimo, financial advisor at Wealth Enhancement Group, as we said, specializing in planning for families affected by autism. He's also the founder of Autism Communities, joining us there from Blue Point, New York.
Hey, let's get an update on the latest world and national news. For that, we go to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. Israel is on high alert and prepared for a retaliatory attack from Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met today with his top officials to consider options. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby on the U.S. preparations.
We're talking about an attack on an ally and a friend and a partner, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that they have what they need to defend themselves.
Kirby refused to say what retaliatory actions the U.S. could take if Israel is attacked by Iran. The House today approved a revised version of the FISA Act that includes procedures for surveilling foreign targets. Bloomberg's Irv Chapman has more on the debate before the vote.
Intelligence Committee Chairman Michael Turner backed the bipartisan bill.
We spy on Hezbollah, on Hamas, on the Ayatollah, on the Communist Party of China. We'll lose the ability to disrupt terrorist plots, identify spies.
Republican Tom McClintock co-sponsored an amendment considered by some as a poison pill, backed by the Republicans right and the Democrats left.
We cannot discount the dangers we face at home from the very powers that this bill would continue. That scares me as much as a terrorist attack.
The bill was written with provisions to limit what the FBI can do. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden's administration is set to forgive almost $7.5 billion in student loan debt. The plan announced today will affect an estimated 277,000 borrowers. Almost half the total cost will go toward people enrolled in the Save Repayment Plan, which the president announced back in 2023. This is on the heels of another Biden plan outlined this week to forgive the student loan debt for about 4 million borrowers. Speaker Mike Johnson is meeting with former President Trump this afternoon in Florida. Today's meeting has been billed as a major announcement on election integrity. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A losing day on Wall Street on the week. The S&P 500 index was down 1.6%. Today we had the S&P falling 75 points, finishing the session heading into the weekend at 51.23, lower today by 1.5%. Again on the week, the S&P dropped by just about 1.6%. Dow Industrials down 475, lower by 1.2%. To be clear, down 1.2% today on the Dow. NASDAQ was down 267, a drop of 1.6%. The financial world was roiled by a flare-up in geopolitical risks that sent stocks tumbling. 10-year 4.51%, 2-year 4.89%. Spot gold down $20 the ounce. Spot gold at $23.43 for gold, a drop today of just about 1.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.4%, 85.35 a barrel. So it was a down day for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ after bank earnings as well. What was behind the selling of this morning? J.J. Kinahan is the CEO at IG North America, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Business.
It started obviously with Mr. Diamond's statements this morning, I think, which took everybody by surprise in terms of the fact that, normally CEOs say, hey, here's our one standard deviation plan in terms of there's one or two things out there that could give us some headwinds and we're planning for that. Basically, he said today, there's like 7 things that can happen and we're not sure which one to plan for. So that threw the market off a little bit to start.
J.J. Kinahan of IG North America, and again, J.P. Morgan Chase shares, they dropped today after earnings, down by roughly 6%. Again, recapping the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ very much in the red today. S&P finished lower by 75 points, down 1.5%. United States Steel, Nippon Steel shareholders have signed off on that deal. Today, we had shares of U.S. Steel down 2.1%, ADRs of Nippon Steel down 2.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, the contribution of Latinos to the U.S. economy rose to $3.2 trillion in 2021. It would rank 5th in the world if the group were an independent country, just behind Germany and ahead of the UK and India, this according to a report released last fall. So, Carol, compared with the world's biggest economies, U.S. Latino GDP was the 3rd fastest growing economy during the decade ending in 2021, behind China and India. This, I should note, all from a Bloomberg story back in September.
Yeah, I feel like Bloomberg does a lot of reporting about this, about the importance of following the Latin community, certainly here in the United States, as consumers, as brands, just everything, politics.
I was going to say a political block, too.
Very, very important. Members of the group, though, face pay inequality, stereotyping, Tim, and also underrepresentation, though, still in the workplace.
Cookwall is a nonprofit think tank that is working to change that. The group, in its own words, has a mission to, quote, address bias and uncover barriers to advancement for underrepresented populations in the workplace. Linnea Irvin is the CEO of Cookwall. She joins us from New York City. Linnea, how are you?
Well, it's great to see you all. I'm delighted to be here. I'm well. Thank you.
So the big question that I think I have is how can this be addressed? How can you address bias and uncover barriers to advancement specifically for this group?
Right. I think, you set it up, in your earlier statements. There's tremendous economic opportunity here. And I think that, denying not only the strength of the consumer, the brands, but also the entrepreneur base that is found within this cohort is a huge risk, I think, for the U.S. economy. And I think what we see in the work environment is that there's an opportunity to invite Hispanic and Latino professionals into the work environment to deliver their best selves, their most brilliant contributions to business without requiring them to perhaps hide or basically, how do you say, these burdens to cover up their heritage, their backgrounds in order to advance in the work environment. And that's what we're seeing.
Is there something different from, we often talk about this, that individuals in the workforce, we embrace diversity, and yet there's still a lot of individuals who don't feel like they can embrace their diversity, if you will, or their differences when it comes. Is it something different for the Latino community, other than if it was Black Americans or LGBTQ? Just curious.
Again, there's obviously nuanced in studying this group, but yes, it is different. There's tremendous intense othering around things such as language and accent, and so there's a different pressure to cover with this group. There's discouragement from speaking one's language in the workforce. We see actually barriers to advancement, slower rates of advancement, and pay inequities for those who speak Spanish as a first language, for example, versus those who speak English as a first language. And we do think that there's opportunity here, to resolve this, because ultimately, look, if you have an individual who speaks Mandarin or speaks French or speaks Spanish in the work environment, that actually is valuable when you think about hopping on a flight to a client and or ensuring messaging to your user.
There's a reason why many colleges have language requirements, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's an incredible asset to be able to speak multiple languages.
No, it's a really good point, right? I mean, that's an asset.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, so what do you think the business environment continues to get wrong, or what could they do better specifically in terms of programs or initiatives?
Well, one thing I will say before I hop into that, because I think it's really important, women are really bearing the brunt here. We find that Hispanic and Latino women, in addition to caregiving burdens and things of that nature, they're twice as likely to feel that the way that they're compensated, right, their pay, does not sufficiently allow them to support their dependents. And we're talking white-collar professionals here, right? This is what we study. They're far more likely to feel career stalled than their male counterparts within the Hispanic and Latino community. Where there is board representation, 5% of corporate boards, Fortune 500, the seats are held by Hispanic and Latino professionals, but only 1% of those are women. And so we're really seeing disparities in this particular study in the data as it relates to Hispanic and Latino women that should not go without being called out. But I would say there are a few things that companies can do very quickly. It's along the engage, invest, and then ultimately disrupt some structural barriers. Engage means invite the employee into the conversation. Far too often we see, and we hear from leaders and professionals, and they say, you know what, leaders just often fail to ask the basics. What are the obstacles you're facing in the workplace, right? And how can I help you to overcome them, right? So in some cases, it makes it a lot easier to get at what the most pressing barriers are by just asking the community. And then from an investment standpoint, we think it's extraordinarily important to not only invest in recruitment, but also development, right? Strengthening your sponsorship offerings, looking at how you can deepen skill sets and on-the-job experiences within your teams so that you can cultivate that pipeline for leadership. And hopefully, we see a pipeline long-term that better reflects the future workforce, because this is nearly 20% of the U.S. population, and we do know, it's inevitable demographically that, this will be a part of our leadership as well.
Linnea, I feel like we can't have this conversation right now without talking about the charged political environment that we find ourselves in. And I'm wondering how, right now, that if you found anything in the research that Coqual did in terms of the way that this is now such a charged topic here in the U.S., given that immigration is in focus, given that what's happening at the border is in focus, given that migrants being bussed into different cities around the country is in focus. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. It showed up in our data. It showed up in the qualitative, in the stories that so many professionals shared. 1 in 5 of our respondents, so 21% essentially, have had and have on a regular basis colleagues, share kind of negative things about, immigrants and immigration. And again, these things don't typically come up in one's daily workplace, but they're twice as likely to have colleagues, kind of repeat this rhetoric and make comments around undocumented people, and it's a real alienating experience for them, regardless if immigration is a part of their story. In some cases, they're second generation or third generation Hispanic and Latinos, it is something that. Especially in election year, it's something that they're acutely aware of, right? Because they know the rhetoric is going to continue to bubble up in the coming quarters.
Really appreciate you joining us. That's Linnea Irvin, CEO of Coqual.
All right, just want to mention some headlines breaking. The U.S. announcing new restrictions on trading in Russian aluminum, copper, and nickel in a fresh bid to curb Russian President Vladimir Putin's ability to fund his war machine. This is a move that could rattle metals markets, something we will be looking here in the after hours. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. It is a tough kickoff to bank earnings season for JP Morgan Chase. Wall Street's biggest bank came in with a slight miss on net interest income. It is a sign the benefits from higher rates may be wearing off, but CEO Jamie Dimon is still delivering for shareholders in the form of higher dividends.
We're earning a lot of money. Our capital cup runneth over, and that's why we increased the dividend. And if you ask me, what we like to do is to pay out something like a third, a third of normalized earnings. Of course, it's hard to calculate always what normalized earnings are, but we don't mind being a little bit ahead of that sometimes, a little bit behind that sometimes.
JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon on the earnings call this morning. The income guidance does have the shares trading lower, though. Today we had JP Morgan Chase lower by 6.5%. Other banks out with earnings today included Citigroup. That stock down 1.7%. Wells Fargo, after earnings today, also declined. Wells Fargo missed estimates for net interest income in the first quarter. The stock today down by about 0.4%. Next week, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Beijing has ordered telecom carriers like China Mobile to replace foreign chips in their core networks by 2027. This, according to the Wall Street Journal, citing sources. It does deal a potential blow to American chip makers, Intel and Advanced Micro Devices. Shares of both chip makers today did move lower. AMD down 4.2%. Intel lower today by 5.2%. Some of the other stories that we're following: BlackRock's long-term investment funds took in $76 billion of net inflows in the first quarter, helping to push the world's largest money manager to a record $10.5 trillion of client assets. And those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. For that, we go to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. There are new security warnings for Americans in Israel. The U.S. Embassy there issued a security alert restricting travel for government employees and their families outside certain areas until further notice. This comes after reports Iran will launch a retaliatory strike on Israel when an area near its embassy in Syria was targeted. President Biden was asked this afternoon when he expects a possible attack.
I want to get us secure information, but my expectation is sooner than later.
White House National Security spokesman John Kirby says the administration is watching the whole situation closely with the intention of helping Israel and protecting American troops.
We have been public about the threat for many days now. And you heard from the president himself in the Rose Garden. We're comfortable with the way we have communicated the reality of this threat and the conversations that we're having with Israel.
Kirby refused to discuss the size, scale, or scope of the attack they're expecting. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Arizona today after the state Supreme Court there on Tuesday upheld a near total ban on abortions put in place 160 years ago. She's in Tucson for an event focusing on keeping abortion legal. A growing number of drugs are in short supply around the country. That's the word from pharmacists who responded to a survey by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists and the Utah Drug Information Service. The survey found in the first 3 months of the year, there were 323 active medication shortages, surpassing the previous high of 320 back in 2014. Adderall, used to treat ADHD, is among the hardest to track down. The popular new class of weight loss drugs, including Wegovy and Ozempic, do not appear to cause a heightened risk of suicide or self-harm. That's the conclusion from the European Union's drug regulator. Day 2 of the Masters underway. Bryson DeChambeau is the leader at 8 under. Tiger Woods did make the cut at 1 over. He is tied for 25th. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Carol and Tim.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Carol Masser, Tim Stenevec, getting ready to wrap up our Friday edition here and wrap up the week. In an interesting day where I will say, going back to how the market closed, Bill Maloney was in here earlier and said, if we close above 51.20, which was the 50-day moving average, if it broke below that, that would be a significant closure and potentially maybe could be an indication, I guess, of breaking that technical level to the downside. Not a good thing. But we actually saw some buying into the close. So we'll see what happens this weekend in terms of the tensions in the Middle East.
We will. We should note that equities did see their worst day since January. This after the report that Israel was bracing for an attack by Iran on government targets. Approximately 40 launches, Carol, were identified crossing from Lebanese territory, some of which were intercepted. That's according to the Israeli Defense Forces, writing in a post on X.
All right, so that we are certainly keeping an eye on. Having said that, stocks here, the S&P 500 specifically, down the most on a weekly basis, down 2.5%. Forgive me, down the most, I should say, on a weekly basis, the most since October 27th of 2023. We talked about this earlier. You remember that date? That's when we started to see a turn in the S&P 500. A bottoming out and then a move up of about 27-28% here to the high in March of this year on the S&P. So something to keep in mind. Having said that, want to thank our team.
We got a great team
do.
here at Bloomberg Business Week.
They get it done. Meredith Frank, Juan Torres, Sarah Livesey, Sebastian Escobar, Elizabeth Sedrin, Justin Milliner, Colin Tipton, Anthony Mancini, and of course, Paul Brennan. Always getting it done for us. We couldn't do it without them. It's been a very busy, intense week, so we appreciate
everybody in the
you
control
guys
room
do.
is just like screaming right now. They're so happy. They're so excited that
They're
it's
like,
Friday.
Yay, yay. Having said that it's Friday, that means tomorrow, Saturday at 8 a.m. Wall Street time, you can catch Bloomberg Business Week on the